Welcome, everyone, to the third event of Sitecore Headless Development User Group. This is a user group we do exclusively devoted to the headless development with Sitecore, things like Next.js, of course, XM Cloud, Experience Edge, anything underneath, sometimes maybe tricky JavaScript framework. For example, if you want to do some exotic framework like Svelte with Sitecore, you're also welcome to share this knowledge. So all the things headless is always welcome here. So today we have really interesting presentation. We have three sets of presentation and 5 speakers, actually, more than we ever had before. So we start with the guys from Kazoo. And if you haven't heard of this name, if you haven't been to SubCon North America, this is a definitely great thing for you, at least to be aware of, but ideally you should play it yourself. Nabil and Sana from Kazoo, they will basically what they do, they will showcase a migration from a legacy MVC way of doing things with Sitecore to a new way of headless. And to me, it looks like magic, but that works. I was really much impressed when I first time saw Kazoo in action, but again, it's much better to see rather than hear 1,000 words about it. So the guys will start with Kazoo showcase. Immediately after, we have Liz Nelson, who will tell us about modern rendering architectures for digital experience. Liz is returning presenter. She was involved in the opening session, and that was honestly so much impressive. If you haven't seen that, please refer to the recording because everything we have here is recorded. Immediately after the meeting, it is shared in the Headless Sitecore Telegram channel, but a week or a few weeks after, at the end of the month, typically, it also gets published to YouTube. So all that is available at YouTube channel. You can watch these recordings wherever you want. And eventually, the third presenter, actually 2 presenters, third session will be a journey, a success journey for XM Cloud with Children's National Hospital. We'll get 2 presenters, Chris Sulam and Matthew Richardson. They will tell all these things they learned hard way about how to build, deliver, and troubleshoot XM Cloud solutions. So the real XM Cloud solution for the healthcare client. So that's what we have so far for today. And I'm happy to start. I'm passing control to Sana from Kazoo. Sana, you are the host. It's all yours.
My name is Sana Kamamaz. I'm the director of digital strategy at Tech Guilds and Kazoo, 3 times strategy MVP. And my background is in marketing business. I've been in the space for more than 10 years. And just for the record, my voice is usually better than this. I'm just recovering from being sick. So yeah, bear with me. I've been writing my key success metrics, and one of them is mute before you cough. So you should be okay. And I'll see if I can keep that. Nabil, over to you for a little introduction.
Hi, everyone. Nabil Orfali, founder and CEO of Tech Guilds and Kazoo, 7 times Sitecore MVP. Started working on Sitecore since Sitecore version 6, 2008, and happy to be here today.
All right, perfect. So here's what we're going to talk about today, and it's about migrating from Sitecore MVC to XM Cloud, and we're going to talk about what is involved in the migration in a like-for-like scenario, and then we're going to share what to expect and the challenges that you might come across, how AI can help, and then our recommended solution along with the demo of that solution, and we'll open it up for Q&A. All right, so XM Cloud, a little analogy. XM Cloud is like getting fit. Most of us are sold by the results, but getting there, the effort, what it takes is actually tedious. Why is it easy to like XM Cloud? Well, because it's headless, it's composable, cloud native, so no more upgrades needed, and it has great features for all technical and business users. But the path there is actually requires a bit of work. and it involves quite a bit of work. Here's 4 categories of tasks that you would have to take care of in a like-for-like scenario for migration from MVC or from XP to XM Cloud. There's first the setup, and then the conversion migration, then the reconstruction of the pages, and last but not least, there's the launch. And the size of the circles here correspond to the amount of effort that is needed for each one of them. So let's dig deeper into each one of them. Starting from the setup, what you have to do here is to provision the new Sitecore environment on XM Cloud, and then you would have to set up the CI/CD pipelines, or in other words, the DevOps automation. You would have to install the relevant connectors and integrations. You would also have to create a new headless application using the desired framework, whatever it is, Next.js or React. We do have recommendation. I'll touch on that later. And then connect the headless application to the new Sitecore environment because we're using the Sitecore first approach. After that comes the conversion and the migration process, which requires you to document a full list of all MVC components that need to be migrated, and then to migrate the main layouts based on markup and styles from the MVC implementation. You would then have to rewrite all the components to use the desired headless framework. And you can appreciate why this component here is actually the one that takes the largest amount of time, because it's actually a rewrite from MVC to headless. And that involves migrating the data source templates, moving the backend logic, implementing the front-end rendering, as well as verifying the functionality to make sure that everything is working properly. And then last but not least, you would have to migrate the page and branch templates. The third step is to reconstruct the pages. And for that, you would have to migrate the content items to the new Sitecore environment. And in a like-for-like scenario, this can be done by copying over from the old environment using serialization or packages. But then after that, you would have to write a script to replace the old MVC components with the new headless ones in the presentation details. And there's, of course, the launch-related activities, which include deploying the newly converted solution to XM Cloud, performing end-to-end testing to make sure everything is functioning the way it's supposed to be, and then performing a DNS switch to bring down the old environment and make the new site public, and then decommissioning the old MVC-based environments. All right, so challenges. They're the business side and the technical side of the challenges. And starting from the business side, there is always the issue of buy-in, and that's especially tricky in the like-for-like scenario because it's potentially more complicated or more difficult to make the case for rewriting the entire components, the list of components, if it's not actually combined with a facelift, with a visual facelift. There's also the skill set. As you might know, the MVC XP is heavier on the back end, and headless is the other way around. It's heavier on the front end. And so the switch between MVC to headless comes with this kind of like a learning curve that usually also results in extra spend in time and money. Moving to the technical side of things, I'm going to share, this is not a complete list, but it is some of the challenges that we've come across, and I'll share how we solved some of these. So the first being that JavaScript frameworks are advancing very fast, and Sitecore is catching up to that. However, the early versions usually come with hiccups, and so that's something to watch out for. There's the fact that there's no support for dynamic layouts in the React JS applications, and so that's why we recommend using Next.js. And there's also the server-side rendering, which we use to address some of the SEO issues. And we've tried to address those by using proxies to render the headless applications, but we found some issues in the modules and integrations, and so we resort to using the integrated mode for hosting the headless application. You're probably aware of there are tools out there that are AI-powered to help in the development process, starting from the sketch to code or tools that do code automation, code suggestion, code review, and some of them even write unit test scripts There's even, platforms that plug in an AI model into an optimized interface where you can actually enter MVC code and it gives you headless code, which all of these are great. There's definitely a step up from the manual process. But we wanted to take that a little bit further. We wanted to create a platform that takes into consideration the entire process of the conversion and migration, and also takes into consideration the team that works on such projects. And that's why we created Kiju, an AI-powered digital experience builder that has multiple use cases and scenarios, one of which is the conversion of websites from Sitecore XP to Sitecore XM Cloud much faster. And today we're going to show you how it works. It automates multiple steps throughout the process, starting from the creation of the pipeline, the DevOps pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline, moving into the documentation of the components that need to be migrated, into migrating the main layouts, rewriting the components to headless, migrating the data source templates that are used by the component, implementing the front-end rendering, migrating the page and branch templates, as well as migrating the content items and replacing MVC with headless components in the presentation details and into the actual deployment. And with that, you could save up to 70% of the time and cost that is involved in like-for-like migration from XP to XM Cloud. So we wanted to show you how it works. And for that, we have a scenario. Nabil, do you want me to go over the scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have this website that is amica.ca, and we have the homepage, which is on Sitecore XP 9.1, and we want to convert it to XM Cloud, and we have a number of acceptance criteria. We want all the homepage components to be converted to headless, and specifically Next.js. We want to preserve responsiveness. We would also want to achieve all the accessibility standards, the area and custom attributes, alt text, all of that. We need to meet all of these requirements. And we want the converted components to be fully dynamic using the same data templates fields, and to be 100% experience editor and Sitecore pages friendly. They also need to be able to display content from any compatible data source, and they need to be allowed on the relevant placeholders. And last but not least, of course, we want the generated code to be clean using CSS modules and should build properly with the existing JSS code base. And so with that, I'll give it over to Nabil to show us a demo.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Sana. So as Sana said, this is basically the long list of acceptance criteria that I need to achieve in this demo and show you how we can meet all of them. So Sana is the client right now and is going to keep me on check. So in this demo, I'm going to follow the exact same scenario. This one homepage of Amica that has 8 components. I'll convert them from Sitecore XP MVC implementation into headless Next.js and deploy them to XM Cloud. So here, this is the, let me go from the beginning. So this is the, Kaju dashboard. When you first land, you have sections here, the dashboard, project list of design systems that is interactive, that, for your brand, and configuration, where you can configure connection between Sitecore source, MVC, or the destination as well when you generate code and deploy. This deployment logs, where you can see the outcome of the build and CI/CD pipeline, and list of integration. So here I'm going to go and create a new project. So I'll create a new project. I'll call it Amica MVC to XM Cloud. And then here you can see we have 4 ways of creating experiences in Kaju. You can convert literally a hand-drawn sketch a component on a piece of paper and upload it. You can import from Figma. But in this scenario, more importantly, you can convert any site to Jamstack. And in this scenario, MVC Sitecore to XM Cloud. So I launch that wizard. I choose Sitecore as a source. and I put the sitemap URL. Then I choose the site configured, the Sitecore instance for the source that is configured in Kajou previously. And once you go next, you are presented with a list of pages, unique page templates that are on the Sitecore XP and MVC implementation. And you can choose the page that you want to convert. So in this scenario, I'll choose the home page. As you can see, it has 8 components on the home page. It's rendered here. So now I will go next. And what happens when I go next? It will make a call to Sitecore on the source. And because you installed previously the Kajou plugin on the Sitecore MVC, we make a call and we know that this page has these 8 renderings on it. And we gather all the information about the rendering and data templates associated with them, the page template, all the content associated with that, the content items, and we present them here to be converted. So then you would just go next and hit convert. And then, now what's happening is all the magic happening in the background right now. The algorithm is going and scanning and modeling all the front-end code, including the CSS, reference styles, media queries, breakpoints, accessibility attributes. Also, it maps all of that front-end markup with the rendering breakdown and data templates associated with them, plus the content items. So the algorithm is going to scaffold all of that and convert this page with all its components and content and data into the Kajou standard format, the canvas format, and we'll create all of that in Kajou. And from there, you can generate the code and deploy it to any headless site in any language, Next.js, Angular, Vue, or React. But let's see right now, it's converting. Usually it takes, depends on the complexity of the page, but it takes anywhere between like 5 minutes to half an hour sometimes. So now it's done. It converted these 8 components into and one page into the Kajou format, and you can hit import and import it into Kajou. You can see the import is done, and I have Kajou created 8 components here, dynamic components on this page, and we added the instances of these components into the page in Kajou, and you can double click and go to that component and see how it's all editable, all the markup, the styling. It's completely, you have complete control over these components. You can adjust them or review them. You see it's all responsive. And the whole page as well, like you can check how every breakpoint behaves with all the components on this page at the same time. And here from here, I'm gonna just log into XM Cloud to show you how now we have kind of a plain XM Cloud implementation, and then we'll go back and deploy and see the difference. So I have this demo site. I'll make a headless. You can see it's empty. There's no components, only the out of the box JSS sample components. Okay. Now I'm gonna go back to Kajou and hit the publish button. In the publish button here, you can see 3 options. One of them is you can just generate the code for all these components and page and put it in source control. We integrate with GitHub and Azure DevOps. Or you can just simply download the whole code. And the third option is actually generate the code, check it in the source control, and also trigger a CI/CD pipeline to build the newly generated code with the existing JSS app code and deploy the static files and the outcome to Vercel, and also deploy and create the templates and content items in Sitecore. So for this demo, I'm going to choose deploy, so we can deploy to XM Cloud. And then here, next step, you choose the pre-configured site.
Get DoorDash again, just tell me to go get it. All right, let's
The
go.
fact that those fuckers,
And then I need to clean honey up.
Hey, somebody's gotta mute
that
themselves.
dog could go outside. It's, you are 9 years old. It's time for you to
Martin,
learn
do you want
to-
to mute? Okay, thank you. So here you choose the destination that you want to deploy to. So I have a pre-configured XM Cloud site. And then you go next. You choose the instance you want to deploy to. And then you are presented with this list of components that I converted. You choose what you want to deploy. In this case, I deployed all of them. And now what's happening in the background, as I said, we triggered the build and the deployment. And in the background, what's happening right now is our dynamic CI/CD pipeline is triggered and it's now running. It usually takes a few minutes, but this video is expedited a little bit, but it's just going and, as I said, deploying the static files, the front-end files to Vercel, and also the templates and pages and content into XM Cloud. It sends all this data into the Kajou plugin installed on XM Cloud as well as a destination. And Kajou plugin will receive all this information and creates everything in XM Cloud. Now, drum roll, I'm going to refresh XM Cloud and we'll see the outcome. There you go. So this is the Amica homepage created in XM Cloud. All the components are created. They're editable in pages. And we added them in the same order along with their content items, data templates, page templates, placeholder settings. Everything is ready and it's responsive. Sana, did I miss anything of the acceptance criteria?
All looks good.
So let's just maybe pause for a minute here and see what happened. I just converted a page with 8 components from MVC to XM Cloud in under like 5-10 minutes with no coding.
And that is really impressive. I got a bunch of questions once I finished the build.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see here, like all these components are created. I'm just opening the old friend content editor. And it's compatible, like this is all the, page components, the content items. You can see the renderings as well, created in projects, following all the, best practices of modularity and Helix and headless development. You can see the templates here as well, all created. Amica Headless. All right, and then I'm just gonna expedite that a little bit. And I open the same page in Experience Editor. It's also compatible, backward compatible with Experience Editor. All the generated code works on pages, Experience Editor, as it usually works. You can see all these components added here to the placeholder settings automatically, preserving the same structure. And one more thing for developers, if you can always go back to Kajou and generate the code before you deploy it. If you want to just review the code, you can generate the code in React or Next.js, and we will generate the code and open it in Code Sandbox in real time for you to see and check. So now the code is being generated and we're standing up a Code Sandbox instance. You can see here, those are all the components. Each component has two files, the CSS modules file and the Next.js code file. So this is the Next.js code. It's all following the JSS framework. And those are all the props and the integration. And here you can even preview it here once it's up. And this is really the end of the first part of the demo. Sana, do you wanna?
Perfect. Yeah, but maybe you
Yeah.
can continue sharing rather than
Sure.
and I can speak to the slide. All right. So let's take a look. By using Kiju, I've saved up to 70% of the time and effort that is required for the conversion from XP to XM Cloud. And so the cost went down from, Nabil, if you can move to the next slide, from 55,000 to 16,000. That's over 70% of the time and money that is involved in the conversion of that homepage.
Yeah.
So that's a huge saving, obviously. But there's one more thing. So let's say, for example, after the conversion, we have come across a need to create a new component that was not available in the old environment. So we have designed it in Figma and we want to use it for a landing page and we're strapped with time. So what can we do? How can Kiju help us there?
All right, very good. So you give me the design and I will just build it very quickly with Kaju. So I'll go to Figma. This is the design file. I will launch the Kaju Figma plugin that we built. You convert this component, you come to Kaju, import the Figma design, give it a name. And here you are. This is the component. It's imported. It's same styles and design. And we can just simply drag it and put it on that page in Kaju and deploy it to XM Cloud. How does that look, Sana?
Amazing.
Is that fast enough?
Indeed.
All right, great. And let's see what we have next. So just a few words about where Kaju is at right now. We got featured in a podcast by HubSpot CMO and Zapier CMO, and basically they did a competition. They evaluated 5 AI tools, and Kaju was the winner for among all these tools. So you can see here in the video. Feel free to watch it. It's really great. And we participated. Also, we got nominated in the SaaS North Conference, one of 8 startups who got nominated, among hundreds of applications to the AWS Pitch Fest. We went and presented in Ottawa, and also we got nominated to pitch in the Collision Conference. And we got 2 vendor briefings with Gartner and Forsters. And last but not least, we are a Sitecore technology partners, and you will hear soon, early next year in January, in the next few weeks, that Kaju will be the official or recommended MVC or Sitecore XM Cloud migration tool by Sitecore. So this is all like good signals about the success of the product. And that is it. Sana, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think we can. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Zoom is giving me a hard time today. Sorry for that.
All
Yeah,
right.
I think we can wrap it up, and I believe we have 10 minutes for Q&A if we can do that.
Yes,
Yeah.
we've got a bunch of questions, but before we go to the questions, thank you very much, guys, for showing it up, and all these awards and recognition you just mentioned is very deserved, deserved to what you've done. I've been watching development of Kazoo for almost a year, from the beginning of 2023, and I was initially impressed, and I now impressed. So good luck on this road. I will abuse my speaker's right to start with my own question first. Sorry for that, guys. I will do that. My first question is, do you support rendering parameters for all the components?
We do not support rendering parameters right now, but it's in the top of the roadmap, and we'll be tackling that, first thing in the next quarter.
Okay. Another question I have is, I believe I get the answer, but I'd like to hear officially. So how do you deal with the pages like multi-versions? Like you may have different presentation per different language and language version, right? I assume you are using English version by default, or whichever is default language, but I just wanted to hear this back.
Yeah, we use by default the English version, but you can put a URL if you want, and from the tree you can choose what version you want to convert.
And if it has personalized components, I assume you just take the default one by default, right?
Yes, we take the rendered one on that page. What's rendered on that page?
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, let's see what we have in the chart. One of the questions was, is it going to cover the pages which are having Sitecore forms? And it's a tricky one because there is no Sitecore forms in XM Cloud. So obviously what you do, you migrate the UI and layout and components, right? There's no Sitecore forms in XM Cloud. The one is coming very, very shortly. The composable one, which derives from actually Sitecore Send, not from original Sitecore forms. I even saw the traces of its code in the SDK already, but I'd better give it to you for the official answer.
Yeah, so we don't convert Sitecore forms today. We started to kind of like support Sitecore forms, but we stopped because we knew that Sitecore is going away from Sitecore forms. So Sitecore forms is not supported right now. So I just want to like set the stage here for a minute. Kazoo is an accelerator tool. It saves you a good amount of time in development. It takes away the mundane work. But the recommended approach really is you convert, bring it to Kazoo, generate the code, put it in source control, and pick it up as a developer in your Visual Studio project to, continue with your own process. So Kazoo generate codes that is standard. It has 0 vendor lock-in. There's nothing in the code that is proprietary or referenced Kazoo by any means. You own the code. It's the exact same standard code that you would usually write, but it just gives you that boost and time saving to accelerate the migration and the conversion of the components to headless by anywhere between, depends on the complexity, by 40% to 70%, depends on the complexity of the pages and the implementation. So just want to make sure that this is clear. Again, I wish it's a 100% magic tool that converts everything without any work, but it's not. So.
And that actually answers another question. Is there any logic inside of rendering that will it understand and converts to or does it only look for the layout? So yeah, you actually answered this question. Another one,
but actually, I have an answer, a more detailed answer of that question. It's a very good question. So, Kazoo generates the front end code, the layout and styling and breakpoints and all these good stuff. Now, the recommended architecture here is that you can do all the functional interactions and animation you would do on a page, or even the business logic. I recommend that you do kind of a twin component for each front-end component and make it as the controller component, where you have all the business logic and anything that controls that front-end component into this twin component. And this way you separate the front-end layout and styling from the logic. And this way you can always keep the components in Kazoo and do any modification of the front end. And when you generate the code again, you just keep that code intact and you just extend using that other twin component. It's a very famous architecture that we vetted with Deloitte Digital because they're one of the customers using Kazoo right now.
Really good approach. I like it. There are a few more questions. Any plans to support Tailwind CSS?
We purposely refrained from supporting any opinionated framework. There's tons of them. I know Tailwind is the most popular, but we are making it a little bit more open, where a design system in Kazoo would function as your kind of like global CSS. So you can add any classes to it and then use it in the canvas. So we thought about supporting Tailwind, but it's not in the near roadmap. We purposely keep it open.
Yeah, and I think it's the right approach. At least I very like the code you generate. So you are using these module CSS files as a counterpart for the components, and I think that's good approach. You give it to people, and you are deciding what you want. Maybe you will do that later as an option, which would cover this scenario. Okay, nice to have. Another question we got: can Kazoo deal with SXA2?
We're actively working closely with Sitecore to support generating code for SXA Headless. So we are in the middle of supporting that. Yes.
I think the question was for input, but in that case, definitely yes.
Yes, it's the input and then taking that and put it in the output as well. Including variants and rendering parameters and all these good stuff with SXA Headless as well when we generate the code.
This question from Neil, how would this tool help if all our components are governed by design system, different team? So I don't think I get this question right. Maybe Neil, you can step in and do more clarification to it.
Neil, you're muted if you wanna unmute. Can they unmute, or they can't unmute themselves? How did it set up?
Yeah, ask to mute.
There you go.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, just basically, we got different design system. The component it generates. How do we pass to them?
Okay, great question. So what I didn't show you really is the interactive design system of Kazoo. So we have, you can create a design system for each brand or client or, style guide. And this acts as the global style sheet as well. So you can see here you have the color palettes, you have your custom breakpoints, and you can customize them and add and remove. You have your fonts, the different styles of every header, paragraph, button, and links, all the atoms basically in an atomic design principle way. So, the way you use that. So again, you can style, of course, click on any of these variants and style them visually, or you can copy and paste your CSS class here. This is like a mini Visual Studio editor here with IntelliSense. But the way you action that and you use it, if you go to any project, let's say here, for example, this component, you can click on the design system here, and you have all the color palettes, all the design tokens. But more importantly, you can go to the elements and drag and drop any of these elements that is pre-styled, sorry, and add it to the component. So you can build components very easily from the design system. And this way you have like an interactive, actionable design system, directly actionable in the canvas. All right, I see a thumb up, so it seems I answered the
Awesome,
question.
thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So does Kazoo keep CSS classes consistent when you generate components for several different pages? That basically a logical follow-up to what you just said.
Yeah, so exactly. So now you can see here this link, for example, I can apply any variant of that link. And when I apply the variant to that link, what it actually does in the generated code, it references this class from the theme, which is, again, acts as a global style sheet. And then will be like a centralized CSS class, not repeated, but referenced across multiple components. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
No problem.
So how and if Kazoo does Kazoo retain the HTML markup when migrating from existing website?
It does. It does retain the exact same markup, and it actually also, you have the option to convert, like, you know, in some implementations you have a rich text editor and HTML is inside the rich text field, and we know it is not ideal. So there's an option for Kazoo to also convert the rich text markup into the DOM here. So you can clean it up here. You have the opportunity to clean it up or change it. But yeah, it preserved the exact same markup and exact same styling with all the media queries, reference styles, yeah, and even accessibility attributes. Actually, I didn't really show the accessibility feature. We have a built-in accessibility checker. You can check in place the component you're building in real time, and then you can remediate the accessibility issues so you can be compliant day one when you generate the code. So if there's an issue here in this element, for example, you can go to the accessibility section and you can add any area attribute, for example, here. And then the value here, you can either put a static value or you can get the value from the CMS. It acts as a prop in the data section here.
Wow, this is mind-blowing. But it's logical since you are in control of palette, in control of all the styles, in control of all the elements. Of course, you can do this accessibility check. Really cool. I will ask you the final question, probably the most sensitive. You guess what is it about? So how does licensing pricing work? And there's another licensing question. Is it possible to use the Kazoo license just for one-time conversion for the code from Embassy Headless XM Cloud? And after that, customer can continue their way of managing code, design, infra, CI/CD, you name it, without Kazoo. So would it be cheaper that way? So can you please give more highlight on the licensing in general?
So Kazoo is a SaaS platform, and the license is basically, we have multiple packages, but it's a yearly subscription. So you can't subscribe for like one project only. When you subscribe, you have a month, a year, full year to use it for, you know, multiple projects or multiple components. And we have two types of licenses, either the end user license, the client license, where marketing department can use this to build components, or even developers build components and launch pages. And the other license type is the agency license, where Sitecore partners can actually purchase Cashew and use it for multiple clients. And we have different packages and sizes for different partners. Depends on like number of projects, number of design systems, number of users, number of converted pages, these kind of factors.
Okay, thank you, Nabil. Thank you, Sana, for this wonderful demo.
No problem.
Yeah, I see you're doing even bigger progress than I expected. And with that in mind, I am passing control to Liz for the next presentation. So Liz, you are now host. Would you mind to introduce your topic, please? And feel free to share the screen.
Hi, everybody. Today, so 2 meetings ago, I talked about JSS and how component level data fetching works in Next.js with JSS. Talked about the app router and why I think app router support is kind of interesting approach to doing React and Next.js development. And so today I was sort of going to take a higher look at just frameworks in general, kind of ground ourselves in how we got to where we are in the internet, and how we might inform a framework strategy, both as like a customer or a partner organization, and fundamentally like as a DXP provider as well. So that being said, let's get through this. This is the me slide. As of next week, I'm now a senior product manager at Sitecore. However, this presentation is not on behalf of Sitecore, and it is very much one rooted in my own opinion, hopefully an opinion that may have some influence, but just this is not a testament to a roadmap, but merely just a kind of thought exercise about how frameworks are working these days. And this is stuff I like and stuff I've been playing with recently. Okay, so the agenda for today. The way I'm gonna do this is first we're gonna kind of take a tour of like the last 20 years of web development, and then kind of ground ourselves in like, I think some of the more interesting rendering architectures being posed right now with meta frameworks. And then we'll kind of take all of that to help us like form a framework strategy. Okay, and I'm gonna try to pace myself so that I can get this done in 40 minutes. I'm a talker though, so I apologize if I go over a little bit. Okay, so framework history. We're gonna kind of cover like server-side frameworks, the original performance improvers of early web stack stuff, talk about single page applications, and then kind of dive into Jamstack architectures, and then talk about all the goofy, weird stuff that's happening now. So we're going to ground ourselves in server-side frameworks. In the before times, we built 2 web apps. We had our backend dev and our front-end dev. And our backend dev is building a web application with a server-side framework like .NET, Django, Laravel. And then we have to remember that like all that JavaScript we're writing for front-end interactivity is in itself a second web application. And even this differentiation between front-end and back-end dev and the tool set they're using, the languages they're using, tend to have a line in the sand. So let's just think about the architecture of how a multi-page application renders. So I've got my browser, it goes out and it makes a request to a server application. That application has some sort of separation of concerns framework, MVC, MVVM, where let's talk about MVC. We hit a controller. That controller is handling some routing and some kind of business logic. It goes and it fetches some data utilizing a model. It then populates that data into a presentation view. And then that controller spits out some static HTML, some CSS, some JavaScript files, sends those off to the browser. And that static HTML is loaded into the browser. And then on the browser, that JavaScript begins to run. So we run that JavaScript and it updates that static HTML DOM to add all the interactivity, all the event listeners and everything to kind of add interactivity into our site. And then finally, once all that JavaScript is built and the DOM has been updated, now we have our browser state, which is also a kind of second web application. So two web apps going on here. Now, what was the good stuff? Some things to remember is that, and somebody pointed this out to me the other day, prior to our server-side web frameworks, like we're doing things like running Flash in the browser, right? Things that like are highly interactive, but just impossible to scale and to manage in any real way, and not performant at all. And server-side frameworks all of a sudden give us this like clean separation of concerns where we can handle our data in one place or presentation somewhere else. We can make a client-side app that just handles client-side interactivity, but there's some trouble there. Let's see, so network communication, right? Full page reloads. Every time I need to communicate back to the server, I'm refreshing my entire web page. The transit time for any like data exchange between server and client start to add latency to our client side situation. State management in the client, really difficult. We start storing global state in the window object. jQuery is really just meant to kind of add some event listeners here and there, toggle some CSS classes. And our backend system, we tend to establish global JavaScript and global CSS files that load on every page. And that global JavaScript can ship a ton of scripts that don't really even need to be run on a given web page. And because most of the programming logic lives on the server side, we tended to see sites that had low interactivity built into the front end. We didn't have the right tools for front end interactivity. And when you're building a server-side app, like you're prone to say, well, I'm just going to put it on the server side. Think about search pages and how oftentimes like all of the kind of logic of search pages are stored in the server side, and we don't have like nice, clean client-side UI interaction. So comes the reign of the single page application. Now, single page applications, we think about this as like a full app in our browser, a web application, something as complicated as like LinkedIn or PowerPoint. PowerPoint in the browser, the amount of state management is just absolutely massive, right? Like what am I in editing mode? Am I not in editing mode? Do I have comments permission? Am I in presentation mode or not? Like what's my history of the last like 15 actions I've done? So just an incredible amount of like state to kind of manage in the web browser itself. So how is this actually working? Like in a spa, the thing we ship to the browser is just basically an empty HTML template, right? Like we see over here, this HTML, there's nothing inside of it to visualize. There's a div with an ID, and then there's a script, and that script finds that root ID and then loads the entire application. And that can mean many, many web pages, right? Different URLs are all being served out of one app coming from the index of our web application. And so what does that render cycle look like? We've got a user request to site.com. And we go and we grab the cached index.html page that's sitting in some CDN somewhere. And when it comes back to the user side, all it does is load a blank page because there's nothing inside there but an empty div and a JavaScript script. So as it reads through that HTML, our browser, it says, oh, I got to go get that app JavaScript file. Once that app JavaScript file comes back to the browser, then the app starts to build. And so if we're not using loading states like nice skeletons, what we see is crazy shifting visuals as all the like parts of the DOM start populating. We start seeing, you know, a lot of motion, but not the final web application. Now that JavaScript might need to go and fetch data out somewhere else. So it goes and it fetches API requests, comes back with the data, which then feeds into more presentation that's being built on the client side. And finally, we have our final loaded SPA. And so this final layout is like a robust application, right? It's PowerPoint in the browser. It's Facebook. It's you've got a ton of stuff going on, and so with this applications of that magnitude, we as users we can be patient for the load because we know something really massive is kind of coming to us, but for a marketing site where we just basically have static HTML. This can be really slow, right? And it can feel slow for no reason. We also think about the idea that we now have like one web application, right? That is this client-side single page application, and we no longer have a server application. But subtly, we usually still do, and that's because if we're going to go fetch data to APIs, we don't want to expose all of those tokens to our users, like all the API keys to, you know, services that we might be paying for. And we certainly don't want to like expose them for DOS attacks and things of that nature. So oftentimes what we do is we create a separate microservice that's a proxy just to go and query external APIs. So even though we think of it as one app, like there's still kind of two apps. It's just, it lives completely separately. And that's our proxy service for API fetching. So let's talk about good stuff, bad stuff. You know, biggest thing I'd say is that these single page applications, like they solve Facebook sized problems, right? And so for web sites, web pages, and not web applications, it's often kind of overkill, and it's maybe not the right tool for it. They can be slow to initial load. They're not particularly SEO friendly because you have to crawl JavaScript to make your pages render. One of the things I really dislike about this approach is that it overrides native URL tools. So because you're controlling client-side routing yourself, you don't, you know, you have to manage state slightly differently than you would if you're just using like the web APIs, like native URL things. You oftentimes like query parameters and other sort of subtle arts of URL creation can become something that the developer has to manage. And as I said, you know, there's these security risks. Plus, some of them are creating a whole separate virtual DOM, which means they require their own set of developer tooling outside of just your normal Chrome dev tools. So, you know, if we're developing in React or Vue, we always usually have a little Chrome extension of additional dev tools installed in our browser. But talking about the good stuff, incredibly smooth UI experiences, right? We get dynamic content rendering that doesn't interrupt like a user's activity. So a user can just be clicking around and other content can be loading in. News feeds can be updated while I'm still like chatting in my LinkedIn messages with somebody, and my feed can be updating. And it gives you tools to handle really complex client-side state. And the biggest thing that I think ended up happening is we all discovered that UI frameworks are wonderful for design system development, for just making a single marketing widget. Like some of the tooling that came around React and Vue and Astro and Svelte and Solid and Quick, which are what all of these are, like they made it really lovely for developers to make marketing websites, to the point where the adoption was maybe beyond the appropriate use case for a spa, but the UI frameworks themselves offer a great set of features. And I would argue that these feature set has really coalesced into quite common shared tools. This link here to componentparty.dev, like what you'll see is that all the things you need to do in a UI framework, templating, passing props to children components, accessing some kind of like global context, handling like lifecycle events when components mount and unmount. There might be some syntactic differences and some underlying architectural differences to how each of these frameworks tackle these problems. But from a developer's perspective, it really just, it's a little bit of syntax. But the feature set is really quite similar here. You know, some use virtual DOM, some don't. Some do hydration, some do resumability. But I would say from the purposes of like UI development, really common feature set at this point. So what do you do when you have an architectural model that can be slow and is maybe not the right fit for marketing websites? And then you have this wonderful tool set that developers really like and enjoy in order to make design systems that are incredibly important to marketing site development, you know, non-web application development. Well, we get the rise of the meta frameworks. And so I don't think there's a good name yet. So all of these names are essentially saying the same thing: Jamstack, meta framework, universal JavaScript. I like the idea of full stack React or full stack Vue, full stack UI frameworks, because I think it allows us to kind of think about this idea of two applications in one application, and understand that we're building on top of our UI library frameworks. So I'm a fan of using that, and that's why I named this talk Full Stack UI Frameworks. Meta frameworks is probably the more commonly used term, and then, you know, everybody says Jamstack. So let's kind of dig into what these frameworks do. So as we can sort of establish, it takes a component UI library type framework and it builds a full web application framework on top of it. But, you know, now we get server-side routing, we get compilers and build tools to handle all sorts of efficiencies and code splitting, tree shaking. We've got different server-side rendering architectures, build time static site generation, server time server-side generation rendering. And like, for the most part, with the exception of Astro, which we will talk about, most of these libraries are built on top of a UI framework. So Next and Gatsby and Remix are built on top of React, Nuxt on top of Vue, Angular Universal on top of Angular. But I think they actually stopped calling it Angular Universal and just like made it Angular, which is like the most Angular thing to do, just make like the biggest framework possible. And Svelte has SvelteKit. And so we now have a full web application framework built on top of essentially these small UI libraries. So Jamstack, in its like original kind of Gatsby static site generation framework, I think its rendering architecture kind of feels like this. We still don't really have a server runtime. We have build time behavior. And so our build time behavior is I run my site build. It goes ahead and goes and fetches any data it needs at build time. It, you know, grabs all of that and it runs through my React and builds static files per route. So instead of having to have a spa where there's only one route, index.html, And all of the like client-side routing happens internally into the application. So I have to load the whole thing, no matter what route I'm searching for. In this circumstance, we now have like some means of page-based routing. And so I can just go and hit my static HTML file built for, I don't know, some blog page, like deeply nested blog page where I don't need to load every single thing about my web application to read one blog. I want that static page. I want to be able to hit it as fast as possible. So grab my files, and now I've cached them on a CDN for my users. Now a user comes along and says, I want to go see that blog file. It goes and it grabs the static HTML and the underlying JavaScript that is going to, in the case of React, kind of like rebuild the DOM on the client side. And so we're going to send that HTML and JavaScript, and we're then going to run the JavaScript, add all the interactivity, and then make sure that that page is now fully interactive for client-side behavior. So it's kind of like traditional Jamstack JavaScript markup files, some APIs that do some fetching. If I need to query additional data on the client, I can always reach out to other APIs client side and grab more data that way as well. And then we Netlify and others, AWS Lambda, start to introduce this notion of serverless functions. And so serverless, that's the definition from Wikipedia. Simplified ones are the cloud is someone else's servers. Serverless is someone else's servers that only they manage. And so what is a serverless function? It's just a pure function that's hosted as an API endpoint. Oh, does somebody have a question? Function hosted as an API endpoint. So I can just hit it and run a function. And so they're typically stateless, right? I give it some input, I run it, gives me the output. And they're meant for short processes. And some of the cooler things that has come out of this is that they can be run on like Node.js server runtimes or on these like lean kind of web API focused edge runtimes. And so now I can start to run functions and do compute on the edge. And now I've got like 3 environments in which I'm really thinking about that I can actually run code: client, edge, and server. And so if I can take serverless functions and build that back into my Jamstack architecture, all of a sudden I have way more flexibility here. So adding serverless functions, I think, is really where we get to what is like kind of considered like ideal Jamstack. I run a build, go and grab my API data, keep running that build, store my static files per route on the edge. Now, when a client makes a user request, I can do a bunch of different stuff now. First, before I ever get those static files, I can run serverless edge functions on the edge, and we can call those middleware, and they can interrupt the routing of our request. We can now do A/B testing with static files. We can do redirects with regards to Sitecore JSS. We can do personalization in middleware. We can do multi-site redirecting in middleware. And now we go and we grab our maybe slightly updated requests on the cache, send it back over to the user. And then again, the same thing, we're running that JavaScript again, populating all that interactivity and putting it back into the browser. And at this point, the user's got this super interactive site, but they see a fully rendered page immediately. It's just the interactivity takes this, hydration process to add to it. And so the other thing that's pretty cool is I can just have serverless functions running in serverland over here to do things like trigger rebuilds. And I can even trigger rebuilds on specific routes given the proper framework. So I can just go hit a serverless function that we might call the ISR route for incremental static regeneration and say, hey, go build back a couple of pages that I need because they've been updated from the CMS, and then go update the cache. And so even with static architecture where we don't have a server runtime, because of serverless functions, we can like start to handle somewhat dynamic, behavior in a very, very optimal way. We don't have a server, we're still storing on the cache as close as possible to our users as like the modern internet allows. And we still get this routing behavior. So to me, this is what we would call, ideal Jamstack. So then comes the rise of all of this new stuff. So most of these meta frameworks now support server-side rendering. Now, server-side rendering, let's go through this real quick. User request, middleware, route the request, still a serverless function. We go and we hit a server, and then we tell it to dynamically build the page that we're asking for. So I'm asking for the home page. Maybe it routed me through localization to the right home page, and now I'm building. Or maybe it's doing personalization and saying like, oh, this user is in this country, so I'm going to direct them to this home page. Now we're building that page route. However, we're building that page route not necessarily as a server, like a Node.js server that we're running it on. In a lot of these architectures, that server has actually just become a bunch of optimized serverless functions, like scaled globally to allow us to build in many places closer to our users. So same thing, go and get some APIs. I generate my stack HTML, my CSS, my JavaScript. I send it to the user. Once that JavaScript is fully run, it populates back all the interactivity. And this would be server-side rendering. So like this model looks exactly the same as multi-page applications, right? So I see somebody even saying, what's the benefit of going back to SSR? So this is what I would challenge you to think. This is not server-side frameworks. This is the same application just being run twice. I'm not writing a C# backend and a JavaScript frontend. I'm writing the same application, and it is doing the same thing at all times, same language, same behavior. I just run the website. I run the build at build time, and then I rerun to hydrate in the client. And I'm getting all that interactivity, and I'm working in one environment. Plus, because of serverless functions and because of some other optimizations built into how these frameworks are working, it is planet scale and super performant. Because I can pick what I'm building at static, like at build time, what's being built in the client. And because I'm building with the same tools, my front end and my back end, it is a lot easier to privilege client-side interactivity because the developers are doing all the work in both environments. So you don't have back-end developers who aren't necessarily thinking about client-side behavior. They are writing those same components. So that would be my argument. It is different because it is one app. We have finally got to one app instead of two apps, because even in single page applications, we secretly have this like proxy app on the server side. So we've got one app in a framework that is like highly scalable, very performant minded. And because we're using those UI frameworks, we're building really highly interactive client-side experiences. And now we're starting to see crazier, weird, like interesting patterns that are emerging from these meta frameworks. And this kind of stuff, I think, is sort of blowing the server-side frameworks, the old kind of multi-page applications away. So let's think about this one, streaming server-side rendering, which is available in Next.js app router. They're adding streaming support in Astro right now. And so how does this work? Now I need to build my page on the server side, right? But I might have different components and they take different amounts of time to build because one of them is doing like pretty heavy compute. It's reaching out to some database. It's building like something super complicated. So I can just start streaming components that are ready to the client as they're built and just wait for those more like heavy server-side compute components to finish. So like I'll get my my header like immediately because that thing is really easy to build. And it'll actually hydrate. So this is selective hydration. That button will actually become clickable before the rest of the HTML page is even built. So I can start getting interactivity into my websites in a streaming fashion while I'm still doing additional data fetching. So now I've got this other thing, and that kind of took a little bit longer to build. And then this guy comes in real fast and hydrates itself. So selective hydration allows us to do this, you know, kind of in situ streaming interactivity flow between the server and the client. One of the things that's actually really interesting about what React did is it created a prioritization logic to hydration too. So if I have, I don't know, a big page and I scrolled, and as a user, I just scroll down to the bottom because I know I'm trying to find some link in the footer. Because I scrolled past the viewport, React will reprioritize hydration to hydrate the stuff that my mouse is near and that's in my viewport. And so we'll also like privilege what is interactive to be what is closest to what the user is actually wanting to click on. So pretty interesting pattern. Other patterns that I want to talk about today is Astro's islands architecture. So this is an architecture that can work SSG or SSR, and Astro is like currently kind of building more of these like streaming ideas and ISR into their framework. But so Astro will render a mostly static page and then just have islands of interactivity that get loaded into the browser. And those islands actually support different frameworks. So I can have a backend Astro framework that has a header that's a React component and then an image carousel that's a Svelte component. And both of those will load their island of interactivity into the client side separately. And then Astro actually provides a client-side state mechanism where I could still share state between these two distinct component systems. So this idea of bring your own UI framework into a backend meta framework architecture is pretty interesting. And Nabil will definitely be talking about Web Vitals in a moment. So partial pre-rendering is Next.js's thing that they just announced in Next 14. And this is, I think you'll see, pretty similar to an islands architecture, but utilizing React only. And here at build time, it's actually an improvement on islands architecture. Let's say it like that. So at build time, we'll build a static shell and we'll recognize that certain components require server-side rendering dynamic behavior. And so we'll cache a shell on a CDN. And then when a user makes a request, they'll get the shell, and then the server dynamic stuff will get built server-side and then flow in to that shell that's already sitting on a user's computer. So we get mostly static site immediately and streaming server-side rendering coming in with dynamic content. And so this is like best of all worlds. We get static, so cacheable, CDN. We get dynamic, so server-side dynamic. We can go and make personalization decisions, go and fetch real-time data. And we get dynamic both on the server and on the client side, all in sort of one framework, approach. So islands and partial pre-rendering, really stunning ways of getting like best of all worlds. So other things to just kind of think about that before we start forming a framework strategy, and I know I am getting pretty over on time. Okay, I'm gonna try to talk faster. Sorry. So we get compilers. Like I think it's important to think of frameworks, these meta frameworks, as compilers. They build really efficient JavaScript. And some of them, like Svelte and Astro, Svelte especially builds insanely optimized JavaScript. And so like we choose our frameworks, they become these compilers that build us the most optimized like scripting we possibly can. We can deploy in a ton of different hosting parameters. We can deploy just a containerized Node.js server. We can do static generation where we just literally building the site and caching it on a CDN or in blob storage even, and like not thinking about it. We can do client side only. We can use these serverless patterns where we're not thinking about a node container, but we're just thinking about serverless functions everywhere. And these frameworks give us this ability to adapt our build to the host. So like Netlify might do serverless functions a little different than Vercel. And so on my SvelteKit project, I can just build my Netlify version at build time or my Vercel version at build time. And I don't even have to think about that infrastructure. And so this is my last sort of, I think, kind of compelling modern thought, which is this idea of framework-defined infrastructure. Now, Vercel kind of coined this term, but I think a lot of providers are sort of making this approach where I want to abstract away infrastructure from application developers. Like, I don't want them to ever have to think about what's a serverless function or what's like a, node container or what's, a blob storage versus like where my optimized CDN images are. Like the hosting provider itself, they're starting to abstract away these infrastructure primitives and just allowing you to build in an application framework. And the host, makes these configurations for you. You can override them if you want, but we're having this idea of the framework itself is sort of defining the infrastructure. Kind of compelling stuff. So I'm gonna try and be very quick about this, but let's talk about this. How do we take all this stuff, all the thing we know about this kind of like framework history lesson and all the new weird stuff that's coming out and use it to form a framework strategy? So let's think about customer framework strategy and then a DXP provider's framework strategy. So what should a customer build on? Fundamentally, I would say whatever they want. Like that, a lot of like the notion here is that there's a lot of choice in this ecosystem. And so how do we like optimize for a particular use case? Well, you should be able to build with whatever you want. And then we just figure out what's best given the circumstance. So this is my kind of quick like breakdown. If we were to think about UI framework comparison, and I have a lot of opinions about Quick. I think it's pretty cool, but like I just used the kind of top trending ones. Really, we're starting to compare things about UI frameworks, like their architecture model. Are they manipulating the DOM directly? Or are they building a virtual DOM? How easy is it to learn? How fast is this thing? How many people use it? Can I, make decisions about like hiring developers based on like its popularity in the ecosystem? And then this syntax thing, are you putting HTML into your JavaScript the way you do in React, which oftentimes can give you, for programmers, it can feel more powerful because you're writing the programming language. But for people coming from a markup background, maybe they want the reverse, JavaScript in HTML, where it feels more like HTML with a little bit of interactivity peppered into it. And then, I would say if you like object-oriented programming, like Angular definitely is class-based in a way that the other ones are not. I would also encourage you to like move beyond class-based paradigms. Think about functional programming, encapsulation over inheritance. And then if we were to think about meta frameworks, I'm going to briefly go through this, but a few things that we can see. Next, it's definitely highest adoption, but there's a couple of like tools that I think are important to talk about. ISR, right? That incremental rebuilds, streaming server-side rendering, image optimization, and then, this potential for partial pre-rendering. So I'll make these slides available, but a couple more things. This question about core web vitals. So if we do an evaluation if we do this evaluation of size of JavaScript shipped versus how many sites are passing core web vitals, we'll see that the frameworks that ship less JavaScript have significantly better core web vitals. And one thing to kind of note here, if we look at this, like Astro and SvelteKit, super dominant in terms of like the amount of the least amount of JavaScript shipped. But we can see Next and Nuxt are scoring kind of the worst here. But even in this report, they sort of note this is probably because those are the oldest frameworks. So there's tons of sites on the internet now that are still using like Next 9. And you know, this is certainly not accounting for the app router that ships significantly less JavaScript than the Pages router. So, you know, we very well may see those numbers changing over time as people start to upgrade from older versions of Next. Astro and Svelte are just newer frameworks, so they kind of, you know, just benefit from having been built utilizing more efficient paradigms. And then Lighthouse scores. So same sort of thing here. So same thing here, right? You've got Astro beating Lighthouse scores. This is medium Lighthouse scores of websites using these frameworks. And Astro is beating like all of them, but there's still a 35% gap between the median Lighthouse score and perfection. And if you ran like an Astro demo, you're going to see a Lighthouse score of 99. So what is that gap? Like ultimately, Lighthouse is a whole lot harder than just meta frameworks. And as Rich Harris so lovingly says over here on the right, the main culprit isn't front-end frameworks, it's shitty ad tech and other third-party JavaScript. When we overload our sites with analytics and just poorly written JavaScript like marketing scripts that are being loaded into our sites, they suffer. When we don't optimize our images, our Lighthouse scores suffer. And so though these frameworks are providing us a ton of stuff, we still as web developers have to think about the kind of core principles of shipping less JavaScript, efficiently, efficiently optimizing our images. And potentially there are some cool tools these days to fix the third-party JavaScript issue. Next has third-party libraries for optimizing Google Tag Manager and YouTube. PartyTown, which is this like third-party library that Builder.io puts out. It's like open source. It takes all of the third-party scripts and it puts them in a separate web worker to move them off the main thread of the application. And that's pretty interesting too, as a way to like handle the fact that our websites are riddled with analytic scripts. So what should a customer build on? I'm going to kind of skip this. It'll go really quickly, but I think trade-offs of cost and performance are always a thing. You get faster performance, there's going to be some hosting costs associated with it. Developer experience, like we need to make sure that we're using tools that are easy to learn, and that we recognize that if we're supporting multiple frameworks, that is oftentimes requiring dedicated resources. And if you have an existing design system, try to maintain it. So here's my flow. What should a customer build on according to me in December 2023? So do you have a choice? If you're a developer or a customer, do you have a choice on what you're going to build on? No, build on that one. Ultimately, all this stuff is like fine-tuning performance over time, right? But like we can all live with the ecosystem that's in front of us and still probably build really fast performant websites. But if we have a choice, then I'd think about, does your team have real experience with an available Metas framework's underlying UI framework? And what I mean by real experience is, do you have design systems already built in React? Do you have a team that has been building in Vue for like the last 7 years? Because if you do, there's a cost to retraining, there's a cost to retooling. So if you've got like that real experience, not just like, I looked at Angular and I think I like that more than another one. That's not the cost there of learning a different framework, not that hard when you have to learn any of them, right? But if you've already learned one, probably use that one. Now, those two things aside, what do you build on? So Does your site need a lot of compute at server runtime? Are you running a lot? Are you creating a lot of dynamic data on the server? If so, Next.js all the way, right? It's got all of the tools for that, like fastest possible server-side rendering. If not, does your page have like over 10,000 pages? Because if it does, you probably need ISR, because you're going to start getting over 10-minute build times to build your whole website, and you'd probably benefit from an ISR strategy. So you look at what has ISR, Next, and SvelteKit, have them on limited hosting providers. Astro is experimental ISR as of Astro 4.0, which like launched last week. But this is me in December of 2023. Now, does mobile performance matter? If mobile performance matters, the biggest issue here is image optimization. In which case, use a framework with image optimization. Next has great image optimization. Nux and Astro does as well. So if you don't have any of these things, which probably means you have a little static site, my only question is, are you a large non-software enterprise? If you are, you probably want enterprise tooling. And you probably want to be able to hire any developer in the ecosystem, like an experienced one. You want a large work pool. So pick one of the enterprise solutions, Next or Next. If you're a software company and you have like a ton of really smart, dedicated developers who do whatever they want, or you're really small and really static, and you don't need global scale, you just need static site generation, I would say Astro and SvelteKit, probably like amazing options. I love SvelteKit, learning to love Astro, or just build on whatever you want. Like they all do static pretty well. So this is my kind of workflow. And I'm so sorry I'm running over. I'm going to try to be really fast about this. So ultimately, the other question is, what should a DXP support? Now, this is the question that maybe Sitecore is asking itself right now, is what do we support framework-wise? And, the obvious answer is everything. Please your customers, do everything. But what does everything actually look like, and how do you do it in a way that's like maintainable and functional? So let's look at what are the most used frameworks. Let's kind of build data to make our decisioning informed by the state of the world. So this is Stack Overflow's 2023 developer survey of professional developers. And we see React, most dominant web framework. But we also see other things here. Multi-page frameworks are super significant still to the ecosystem, right? .NET Core, .NET, Spring Boot, Django, Flask, Laravel, like the internet is still running on multi-page applications, and we can't forget that. We can see that Blazor is catching on amongst .NET Core developers, but we can also see things like 7.96% of devs are still maintaining sites on Angular 1, Angular.js that hasn't updated to Angular 2, which was like a major change. So the internet also like moves at the speed of enterprise, which is oftentimes fairly slow. And so how do we build a strategy that informs our users about why these meta frameworks are so great in a way that is, treats everybody with respect and helps companies migrate and helps like elevate the developer conversation in a way that's useful? All of that should be informing a framework strategy for a DXP as well. That developer experience, that education, just the respect for the entirety of the ecosystem. So other things that I kind of think are interesting, like looking at this, I'm going to kind of skip over this a bit, but this is this idea that like these are the blue dots are the desired frameworks to work on, and the red dots are for developers who have been building on those frameworks, which ones they really like. And we can see a couple things. React is most dominant desired framework. People using .NET Core love it, right? I would argue that the people using .NET Core are .NET developers. And all of a sudden, when you go to .NET Core, you get like a much more modern ecosystem. And so lovely experience. Svelte, is adored. I love Svelte with like shocking love. And so, you know, we gotta carry in like this idea that like once really smart developers start using stuff, if they like it, that's exciting. That's making their lives as developers faster. They're building better. Let's look at our existing customer base. So if we're thinking about Sitecore and the site, I'm trying not to talk about Sitecore very much, but this is a Sitecore user group. We have to acknowledge we come from a .NET community, right? And so we're going to have people who are going to love .NET Core and love Blazor. And .NET Core is like, it's really powerful. There's going to be a natural association with Angular because it feels better. But maybe even more broadly, how do we support all multi-page applications? Like not just .NET Core, but what if we have people coming in from, you know, Python frameworks or something? Like, do we support web components? So that way we can do this sort of interactivity with native HTML. And then we look at our current headless customers, we can see that XM Cloud, it's almost all Next.js. With JSS, it's also majority Next and React, because you can see that the tool set being provided by these frameworks actually really quite powerful and seem to be a good decision in building headlessly on Sitecore. So a couple more notes. I promise I won't be too much longer. 56% of professional developers are using GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot has like completely changed my developer practice. It makes typing, like adding types to your TypeScript, like just tedious. Unit testing, like create your mocks and everything with like limited work. GitHub Copilot is making developers faster, and it is loved and well used. And I would argue that AI augmented development is already here. As we saw in our first presentation, we are already seeing like design to code. We're seeing natural language to code, the way V0, Vercel's like UI generation framework is allowing us to do generative UI. Give me this is something I said, give me an e-commerce store for coffee, and it starts to build out my UI components. Framework to framework, UI, framework to framework, converting a React component to a Vue component is becoming trivial at this point. And so if we're not only augmenting our own development practices with AI, but we're adding AI to our web applications, we need to start thinking about what AI needs to help us improve our sites and our own development experience. Few things I'd argue is that because we have to we have like limited context embeddings that we can like add to a natural language model to give an answer back. We have to think about limiting our context and containing our context so that we can get the best decision possible. And to me, that it means encapsulation becomes more important than separation of concerns. That is like CSS modules or something like Tailwind utility classes, where we're encapsulating all of adding our types into the same file as our component. And it's where maybe the split page model of MVC becomes even slightly more problematic, is that contextual awareness to allow AI to make better decisions. We're also going to really care about schema validation, typing, especially when it comes to like API fetching. You see tools like Zod becoming just so much more part of development. And then the biggest one is streaming. Because large language models take a ton of time to output it, you know, to fully respond, we need to be streaming everything that's AI related so that we're getting answers to the client application as quickly as possible as it's building the rest of its, you know, decision making. So if we are really thinking about streaming with regards to AI, that's going to start to inform our practice. The other thing I really want to press is this idea of personalization and user experiences. Content is static, but an experience is dynamic. Experiences, we've got, you know, personalization that might be happening on the server. We might be changing our application state based on user activity, engagement, on the browser. So we want things that are fast so that we're not bouncing out because our users are impatient. We want relevant content, and we want engaging experiences. And all of that to me means that you want to think about streaming for rendering dynamic content quickly. You want to think about cohesive state management across your client and your server and across one page to another or across channels. You want to think about lightweight analytics so that we lower, the cost of JavaScript being shipped to the browser. And then we're going to leverage all of this like kind of serverless features of serverless function edge middleware so that we can do middleware decisioning and A/B testing. So 2 more slides and I'm done. Sorry for taking so long. What does a framework strategy include? The way I would think about it is there's a UI framework level and a meta framework level. And if we were to think a little bit about Sitecore in particular, that UI framework level, we're thinking about components, visual editing components, no code components, code first, SXA, BYOC, and the data fetching tools around component encapsulated like support. And then these experience features, forms, search, personalization, events. And so our UI framework strategy might be a little different than our meta framework strategy, where we're thinking about, pages and multi-site and redirects and other middleware behaviors. We're thinking about like developer experience, starter kits, where all of this stuff is just kind of laid out for a developer to get started quickly. Really good documentation around reasoning through these meta frameworks, because the applications are much more complicated than the UI frameworks. And so this is my what I think would matter in a DXP framework strategy. These are the bets that I would take about the current state of the internet. We should privilege streaming for experiences and for AI. We want everything. We want static stuff. We want dynamic on the server. We want dynamic on the client. We want to think about our meta frameworks as infrastructure as code, so that our meta frameworks are handling hosting provisioning of very complicated hosting environments without really having to worry too much about them. AI generated UI, as we probably have already seen in the first presentation, is like the future. And it is going to inform the development practice of all software developers, especially front-end developers. We want choice. And because converting from one component, like a React component, to a Vue component is becoming more and more a trivial problem, supporting most UI frameworks should just be a part of a strategy. However, with regards to meta frameworks, we need to be a bit more strategic. One other note, web components. There are tons of people who want to use multi-page applications. So let's think about, 2 apps, like all the people who want to still use Laravel and .NET, like providing a web components set of components allows us to open ourselves up to a much bigger ecosystem. And now with applications, these meta frameworks, I'm going to say right now, Next.js is blowing everybody away and they're the leader. And like, if I were focused on a framework strategy, it would be to get app router working as soon as possible. And then what are our next bets on frameworks? To me, Astro is a really compelling alternative. I love SvelteKit. As soon as SvelteKit adds streaming, I'm going to tell you, like, SvelteKit's amazing. But right now, streaming isn't it's in conversation, but it's not totally in the roadmap. So, and what Astro also provides you is this idea of bringing your own framework. Use any UI library you want and put it into the islands. So this is Liz Nelson's opinion on how I would form a DXP framework strategy for customers and for Sitecore, given the current state of the internet. I thank you so very much. I know this took a long time. I hope this was enjoyable.
It was more than enjoyable, and there's I so much love your presentations. there isn't to it. Every time I say it, you drop like a huge bucket of priceless insights on us. Very analytical, very fundamental strategy. But the best strategy for adopting all that is rewatching your recordings again and again. That's why I throw the previous session, number 1 of the headless development Sitecore user group in the chat, with considerations about uproute and new stuff in the Sitecore. So all the way down the presentation, I had a question, the big question, which you actually covered in the last slide. Exactly that. So that's why I will ask another one.
Yeah, go for it.
So how do you see WebAssembly in general and Blazor in particular in terms of wider market and adoption and all the things? Because it was so much promising, but there's much silence around it. .NET Core is awesome, but Blazor is kind of essential part of .NET Core. This is a WebAssembly implementation for .NET Core. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I've played a bit with Blazor. I love .NET Core. I actually taught a .NET Core class at a local community college in Washington State for the past 2 years. Like, love .NET Core. The thing I would say is that WebAssembly is like almost there as a standard, you know, and like its support for there's now WebAssembly being supported in Edge runtimes, and to me that is really important because that starts to open up these kinds of hosting patterns of you know, edge compute, and so running WebAssembly in the edge really important. My bet is it's almost there. My other bet though is that like it's going to be for the .NET community, and that's great. That's a huge part of our community. It would be an investment in the longevity of a more, you know, specific space. And so my kind of bet right now would be to absolutely make a web component standard for everything so that we can at least support .NET Core and maybe give the WebAssembly standard and Blazor. Recent Blazor is pretty impressive, but I maybe I'm not like the best expert on this, but I would say like it just needs just a little bit more time. This is my in December of 2023 feeling.
I have some sort of similar opinion, but since we are on Sitecore related user group, I will raise another question. This one will be Sitecore related. So we expected Sitecore XPXM platforms 10.4 somewhere by November, December of this year, and we know they were delayed. So I start gathering the information for the reason, and one of the reasons for delay for that version was that I cannot quote it exactly, but something like we want to catch it up with the front-end frameworks, something like that. So the way I interpret this version, myself, again, it might be just my opinion, is that it's very much related to what you presented at the first user group. So I think they want to bring app router support into Next.js SDK for Sitecore. And that's why they do delay this version. So this is how I see, but I'm asking the guys who work for Sitecore, whatever you can cover. You have Justin on the call who.
Oh, yeah. No, Justin is on the call, right? I think both of us, I don't, like, we're XM Cloud folks. Like, I can't particularly speak with any real clarity on what's happening in XM updates. With regards to, we should definitely update App Router. Like, I know that that's on the roadmap and that's like aggressively being pushed. And then, you know, you're right, though. There's this, maybe this question about like how to support which frameworks and what that kind of looks like, and maybe level setting, looking at the being, you know, a leader in the space, and how that might look. So I'm not on the product team yet, and I can't really speak to roadmap, but it is very obvious that we're all having these questions. It's not just Sitecore, it's not just one, you know, developer or another. It is a question of like, there's been this change. Some of it is subtle, performance oriented, but like architecturally complex. And how do we reason about it? And how do we make smart decisions? I think I don't know. I mean, I think we're all asking those questions, and I know Sitecore is going to be really smart about it and come up with a great strategy. And this is my little effort of, adding my opinion to that mix.
Which is really valuable. And yeah, I'm proud to, I think all these new changes, they're so much revolutionary. Next supports streaming, and I would definitely agree with you on that. Next.js is far ahead of anything else in the web development globally in principle. So that's number one thing that we have. And if you want to go with App Router and Sitecore today, you can. It's actually supported because with the latest SDK, you already have, saying latest, I mean 21.5 and something. So you already have Next.js more than 13.4, but it's not actually supported by SDK. So you have to do all the things manually by your own, implementing that Next.js stuff. But what I'm actually interested is that when Sitecore brings that support on top of SDK, bringing us showcases, examples, playgrounds, like anything, like good best practices, demonstration, showcase scenarios, like whatever we can just take from them and see how it all plays well in action with Sitecore. So my belief, my understanding is that it will happen somewhere next to April, May time of the next year with the release of 10.4, and when there's much more certainty on how all these frameworks play together. Because again, this is another topic I would agree entirely with you. There's so much happening here in the framework world, and this clarity and certainty needs to be in first place so that people can do more adequate choices. Yeah, but we are looking forward to it almost.
Absolutely. The one thing I would say is that I agree with you. I think that developer experience and a framework strategy includes best practices and documentation and great starter kits. And so, we never want to forget that, like, helping our developers accelerate their, development efforts is incredibly important to a good framework strategy. Thank you guys so much. I apologize to the folks who are going after me. I'm so sorry I took up so much time. This is the first time I've really delivered this presentation, and it definitely took me longer than I was expecting. So I apologize.
Thank you, Liz. We'll talk later to you. And I would like to introduce the final speakers. I was actually a room captain at SUCON for this particular presentation, and that's why I was quite impressed, and I asked guys to repeat it here for us today. So this is XM Cloud Adventure with Children's National Hospital. The way it was presented at SUCON was very much, I would say, specific. It was called Raiders of, I don't remember what was that, but the guys were dressed like Indiana Jones, and they did very expressive presentation. But there's much more practical experience and sense behind the outlook, which the guys will share now. So I am inviting Chris Solem and Matthew Richardson. Chris, I'm passing control to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, actually, can I do that, Liz? Can you pass it, please?
I think I already have it.
Okay.
Let's see. Am I sharing?
Yes.
Yep.
You are.
Okay, cool. Just
Chris, you're muted.
yeah, sorry, child interruption. Okay, so thank you all. I know this has been a long night of interesting Sitecore topics, and thank you for sticking with us. So this is the XM Cloud Adventure with Children's National Hospital. We did present this at SUGCON. Is this thing advancing? Okay, so just a little bit about us. My name's Chris. I've been working with Sitecore for 15 years. Got a couple MVP awards, working on another one.
And I'm Matt. Matt's fine. More than 7 years working with Sitecore specifically. Been an MVP once before. And yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, so just a little bit about our agenda. We're going to talk about essentially our journey in building, a pretty big set of websites with XM Cloud for a large healthcare client. So we're going to start by defining, what we were doing. We're going to get into the technology map, talking about how we, settled on the approach we were going to take. We're going to talk about the preparations we took before we started our implementation. Then we'll get into some specifics about, how we navigated our way through this technology, learning it. And then finally, we'll just, show you the site at the end. And you can see the end result because it is now live, and at SUGCON, we were still a couple weeks away from launch. So the first thing here is defining what we're going to do. And I will pass it to Matt to talk about that.
Sure. So as we kicked this project off, we were looking to re-envision, redesign, redevelop the entirety of the enterprise web presence for Children's National Hospital, which is 5 sites in total. We needed to rebuild and migrate those. Of course, there's a whole design change and everything with your standard redesign, right? But we needed a cohesive user experience across them, consistent visual brand identity. We wanted to make sure that we had a modern, flexible, functional, shared tech platform. So we're reusing components across different sites and all of that fun with the multi-site instance. And we wanted to make sure we were leveraging the latest capabilities of Sitecore to help with the longevity of this for them. And next slide. So with that, we needed the redesign of Children's National to have a modern look and feel with a flexible design system. It had to be responsive and accessible. Certain accessibility guidelines were hitting there around WCAG 2.2, AA. So there's a lot of concern around this, as well as speed for the hospital sites in general. We wanted to improve the customer or the user experience with cleaner layouts, improved navigation features, better performance overall, and then increase major conversions on the site. So personalizing the experiences to audiences, driving more donations to their foundation, helping patients find providers and locations faster, all major conversion points that we needed to increase across the board for these. And additionally, help improve the internal operations, right? So increase the deployment cadence so they can get new features out sooner, reduce downtime, minimize and decrease author load, etc. Were all major operational improvements that we were looking to do as part of this project as well. And with that, we're going to take a quick look at the technology map.
All right, so we've defined our vision and we've defined sort of the success criteria of the project. So now it's time to get into some specifics. So just to give a little context here, this is, it's a pretty big, I don't know if we call it enterprise, but it's an enterprisey web presence. Like this is a very big organization. They're like a top healthcare provider in the United States, and they function, they have a global presence. So their brand was very important to them. And the initiation of this project was actually in 2022, shortly after the European SUGCON in Budapest, just to sort of give you a time frame for when we started working on this project. So specifically what we were asking to build is we had 90 final page designs from our design partner, which turned into over 300 distinct feature tickets. And the vast majority of those features needed to be shared features across 5 different site designs. So we're building one component. That component needs to work on 5 different websites. They also have to be multilingual, including right to left for Arabic language. And as Matt mentioned, we're looking for accessibility compliance. We had a series of integrations we had to worry about too. We had Kairos, which was a provider system that we had to integrate with, a AACT clinical trial database repository, had to make that searchable. We used Caveo as our search provider. We're going to get into that a lot more later. Luminate to manage as sort of like our CRM and driving donations from their foundation site. They had a series of WordPress blogs that they wanted to be imported into Sitecore and sort of federate it in with their other content. And finally, we use form stacks to do any sort of forms we need to do because Sitecore doesn't have a forms module yet. So the first question we asked ourselves, remember going back in time, is like, do we go headless or not? We work for Valier, which is a Sitecore partner. As I said, I've been working with Sitecore for 15 years, and a lot of the people at Valier, we have probably 100 years cumulative experience building Sitecore sites with ASP.NET MVC and on Sitecore XP, right? So we knew we could deliver this project with that technology. That was never in question. However, if you think back to our success criteria, one of the success criteria was to take advantage of the new features of the platform and to set them up for success there. Children's was already on Sitecore 8.2. Their implementation was getting, unwieldy. We talked about the success criteria around deployments and things like that. They were having problems with stability and the amount of time it would take to get code out. So, we wanted to build a solution that was more future-proof, and that led us to headless, and, that led us towards, considering XM Cloud. So we had to ask ourselves when we're considering this, what are the risks? What are the added costs? And how do we find out the answers to that questions? So, the first thing we get to do is come up with a map and a plan. So if you're sort of newish to the headless world, you're coming from someone who was building sites, maybe on XP, like I'm calling that legacy Sitecore at this point. If you're used to building in MVC, now we're going to pick a modern web framework. Liz just had a great presentation about those. I hope you all paying attention. So we went with Next.js. We considered .NET Core, but we went with Next.js just due to the feature set available. If you weren't using SXA before, you're going to use SXA now. It's strongly encouraged. I don't think it's required, but it's kind of like a soft requirement that you're using SXA. If you were using the content search API before, what are you going to do now? You're probably going to be using GraphQL queries. So you want to get familiar with that. Using XP's personalization, now you're using Sitecore Personalize or another composable product. If you're using EXM, you're using Sitecore Send or another composable product. If you're using search, you're using Sitecore Search, or in our case, we're using Caveo. Sitecore Forms, we're using Form Stacks. And Experience Editor, we've got Sitecore Pages, but, you can still use Experience Editor. That still works. So, we've got a rough map here, a very high level map. So, now we're ready to get started, right? So unfortunately, even the best laid plans can and will go sideways. And, with our plan and our map and our experienced Sitecore team, we still had to solve a lot of puzzles and overcome a lot of challenges to be really successful in this endeavor. And, we learned a lot on this, and we want to share with you some of the hazards and pitfalls that we overcame on this journey through the exciting world of Sitecore Headless. And, hopefully so you don't get flattened by the Next.js boulder. So first thing you want to do is start with a little bit of preparation, right? So I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I think it's really important to understand what headless means, because a lot of the time when you're talking to members of your team who haven't worked with this before, or more importantly, you're talking to business stakeholders and, marketers, and they hear this buzzword, they don't really understand what it means. So, quite simply, headless means your content is a service, right? You have an application that consumes the content, usually via some kind of API, and they're completely disconnected in that way. And if you think back to legacy Sitecore, you had sort of these monolith implementations where, the content was right there in the same application that was, building up your web pages and serving them up. Headless does not mean serverless. That is another point of confusion that I think a lot of people have. Next.js, it runs server-side in a Node.js host, such as Vercel. There are other options out there as well. Jamstack, Liz just had a great presentation talking about all these different options. Like, you're not necessarily going to be Jamstack if you go headless. Should you be? Probably. I think right now that's considered, the best sort of a best practice and sort of the most performant way to build your site. And the other thing you want to do now that you understand these concepts is you want to go deep on your requirements, and you want to do that up front. So you want to start to identify some things that you maybe need to do with middleware or as microservices that won't necessarily work in a Jamstack architecture, like as a statically rendered page. You want to assess your integrations, right? You want to make sure that these systems you're integrating with will support the framework that you're building with. A lot of them will. Next.js is very popular, and a lot of the things that you work with will have sort of like native Next.js integrations, or at least React integrations you could take advantage of. But some things might not, especially if you're dealing with a proprietary system from a client. So you want to be able to, like, this worked in .NET. You might want to dig in on that and make sure that you're not caught unawares. Following up on that point, build proofs of concept. Make sure that you can do this in Headless. You can do this in React or Next.js. And I think the biggest thing here is to be wary of assumptions you're making. If you've got a lot of development and, muscle memory, Sitecore muscle memory with MVC and ASP.NET, you can't assume that all of those things are going to work in a brand new architecture and, in a brand new programming language. So what skills did the team need to learn? We talked about headless architecture, and thinking headlessly is crucial for the success. So your team needs to take the time to understand all the technologies in play and how they fit together. You especially want to be careful that you're not agreeing to a requirement or an integration based on the outdated assumptions, like I just mentioned. And then you find out later that it's going to be a lot harder or a lot different than what you're expecting. And that translates into delays and perhaps cost overruns. And beyond that, we've got the new technologies in play, the biggest one being Next.js. So, most legacy Sitecore teams, if you've got a Sitecore team already and if they've been working on XP, maybe on 9.3, maybe they dipped into, sort of doing headless before XM Cloud and Experience Edge and all of that, they're going to have to learn some things. And we found that upfront training was necessary to establish that foundation of knowledge. It's a cost you're going to have to pay, right? And trying to learn this as you go is going to result in, making mistakes that you're going to go back and fix later. And it's just generally less efficient. So we used front-end masters as sort of part of our training toolkit. And there were a lot of really good modules on that about React and Next.js that you can use to build this foundation on your team if they haven't been exposed to this technology at all. And once you've built that foundation, then you start to be prepared to really grok like the documentation on building with Next.js that from both Sitecore and Vercel. So another thing to talk about here, and again, this was mentioned briefly in the previous talks, is like, what are the lines between our front end and back end developers? Right? If you've been building with Sitecore, you probably have people who are experts in .NET, and you've probably got people who are experts in accessibility, who are your front end devs. Maybe they're experts in React and SPAs. Where is the line? Like, what's the handoff there? Where does it go from being front end to back end? What does that look like? And should we just train everybody to be full stack? I mean, that's a question we asked ourselves. That we try to answer. And, excuse me. And ultimately, we wound up sticking with, our front end and back end roles. And the reason for that is to really be like our back end developers are still experts in Sitecore, and having them handle these Sitecore related things made sense. And our front end developers, they're experts in, CSS, markup, accessibility concerns and things like that. And really where the lines blur is when we're actually implementing our business logic. We found that you were really the front-end developer or the back-end developer. Both of them are pretty well prepared to go into, the Next.js components and start implementing the business logic there.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about setting up Basecamp. All right, we had to sit down as a team and figure out how we were going to work. And a little bit this was adapting old working mechanisms we had from MVC days. But knowing we were using a new tech, knowing that the analysts, documentation folks, strategy folks didn't necessarily know yet the implications of the new tech, but the devs were trained in it. The most important thing that we learned and took away from this that we had done, we think worked really well, was bringing those trained developers into the process as early as humanly possible. So when we're looking at designs, even wireframes, we have development representation there. Front end, back end, these folks who've been trained in the platform can think about issues we're going to run into. So during that, reviewing designs, design approvals, writing those functional specs up for how these things are going to be put together, making sure that the team is aware of caveats, right? You need an architect who's thinking headlessly to steer those specs in the right direction. There's new limitations, features, flexibilities, etc. We need to template and content structure needed to be carefully considered in order to be compatible with the new headless design principles. And this whole work, it wasn't automatic, right? There were false starts, some backtracking as we learned some new things, hit new limits and frameworks. Again, we're working on those POCs kind of as we're going, making sure that we're not going to, there aren't any kind of skeletons hidden in the closet. And we found a couple, we had to work around them, a little bit of backtracking. And in order to solve the problem with a new toolkit, new rules, I think it's really important when we were in this design and spec piece of it to really pull back and focus on those base requirements. Like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve? Not thinking about how did we do this in MVC and how do we do it now, right? We've got to bring it all the way back to those base requirements and focus on how do we solve that with our new toolkit. You've got to lose your head, as we were talking about a couple of slides ago, and stop trying to think about how the problem was solved before, because it is a different toolkit and you solve a lot of these problems differently.
Yeah. And oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, jump in.
Okay. I was just going to give some specifics on how our teams worked here. And if you guys have been working in an XM Cloud project, then I'm sure you're familiar with this. But we have our developers working in our Sitecore developers working in local Docker containers. We're using serialize instead of TDS. That's pretty much a given now. Our front-end developers are building in Storybook, and I wanted to just touch on this a little bit. Our front-end devs, they work on Macs, right? That's just what they do. And getting a Sitecore Docker container running on Mac has been problematic at best. It just straight up doesn't work for most of them. And it wasn't really efficient. What they're good at is using Storybook. That's what they were used to. So one of the really nice things we were able to do by virtue of using Next.js is that we were able to unify the Sitecore component with the story in Storybook. So we would essentially have one TSX file that would work in both sort of systems, right? And we had a pattern that would allow us to sort of glue those things together through certain utility files and property mappings and things like that. But essentially, you write the component once, one set of markup, one set of CSS, and it works in both Sitecore and Storybook. So the front-end developer can work in Storybook, make a change. It immediately starts working with the Sitecore component. We get something back from design QA, or we get a bug. We can we make the change once and see it reflected in both systems. So that was really, really good. The other thing I really wanted to talk about is using Experience Edge and Vercel and getting your project on there as soon as possible. There are things that are different when you're working on a local environment or you're working on sort of like a shared virtual machine to, test your app versus when it's actually running on Experience Edge and Vercel. And the list of those things are really sort of like nuanced and arcane, but just trust me that if you're not doing this and you start setting up prod 3 months into your project, you're going to start finding problems and having to go back and fix things. So with our planning and preparation complete, we are now ready to start our journey. And the first thing I want to say is, take advantage of the XM Cloud example solution. And, if you deploy if you set this up right out of the XM Cloud deploy app, you're going to get a ready-made solution that's already connected to your environment, and it's really great, and you should totally take advantage of it. So you're going to get Docker containers for your local Sitecore environment. You're going to get a properly configured SXA tenant, which, may or may not be required for Experience Edge. I've heard from our PTA that it pretty much is. So I'm going with that. And, SXA has a lot of great benefits anyway, so you should be using it. You're going to get example components. So you can actually see sort of Sitecore's opinion on how you should be putting things together. And the project will be ready to deploy. So the important caveat here is to just remember that, like Habitat before it, if you're familiar with that, you don't want to just use this project straight away. You want to make it your own. You're going to get those example components, but maybe you want to pull those out and start making your own, or like move them, rename them so that they match your sort of your client namespaces and things like that. So take the time up front. The overall theme of this is going to be take the time up front and really try to understand what you're getting into, because it's way harder to unwind mistakes or false starts in your provisions instance than it is on just a sandbox environment. So take the time to make sure you're doing things according to best practices. And we learned that from experience, because we started building this project without SXA, and we got about 2 sprints in and we're like, turns out we need it. So.
And
yeah.
Yes, then we're working together here as we're going to go into kind of how the team worked through a lot of this. And specifically, some of this is going to be a little bit rehashed from a few slides ago. We're talking about Basecamp, kind of how we're going to work together here. But through the UX and design process, right, we had dev representative in reviews, making sure that we have those trained developers in those design reviews. It's certainly less important to have them in the UX reviews because there's not a lot we're going to run into there. But if the project budget can handle it, I would recommend even having them in that early, right, when we're looking at wires. And even if this is not a standard procedure for your business, if you're taking your first jump into this headless architecture, working with XM Cloud and Vercel and Experience Edge and all that, it is going to be super important, and you definitely want to push hard for this to be added in as part of the project process. I would say the other important thing during the UX and design reviews is understanding that as you're taking one of your first forays into the new tech and working with that, even if it's your second or third go, there's still a lot of learning that needs to be done. So for these particular projects, try to keep the complexity down and push for more reuse across design elements, across components and code and everything else. We don't want to overcomplicate individual components, but we also don't want 800 components on the site either. There's some give and take here, but ideally we want to push toward keeping the complexity down across the sites wherever possible. For the spec and approval process, again, I just cannot stress enough how important it is to have the development team fully and them have real time to fully review the final functional specs before client sign-offs, right? We don't want to be promising anything that we don't know that we can do for sure, because the developers, when you start off, are going to be the only ones who really know it inside and out, assuming you put forth the effort and early on to have this training kind of done ahead of time. Make sure you give those team members the time to start strategizing the implementation during those reviews. So bake some extra time in for this part of the process. It will definitely take longer, but again, entire paradigms on how we solve problems have changed, and the way we approach those problems from the legacy stack is rarely going to translate into the new one. Because solutions to common problems that we face in every project may look entirely different now, again, make sure we're keeping that focus on the fundamental requirements of the functionality, not how you used to do it or how we used to solve the problem, but what is the problem we're trying to solve for. And with the backend front-end developer handoff, we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's like we had that storybook system where folks could work right in there, only develop it once, and it allowed us to also kind of review that aspect of componentry separate from how it was working when it was in Sitecore, in the environment, and all put together. It also allowed the teams to not necessarily have to work as in parallel as they might have traditionally. And it gave some extra room, I think, for everybody to kind of learn the frameworks at their own pace. So I think it was a big boon as far as how the teams were working together, and would definitely recommend anybody to replicate that. The next thing we want to talk about, though, is how we were handling search. If we go to the next slide, Coveo, our enthusiastic sidekick throughout this process, we wound up with Coveo, because Sitecore Search wasn't ready yet. When we started this project, as a reminder, this was like 2022, like early 2022. So Sitecore Search wasn't a thing. We did need a search provider, right? Who would have search pages on the site. There's also limitations dynamically to what we can get returned in the GraphQL endpoints. So for any super complex querying that needed to be done against the content, we had to kind of rely on the search provider for that. So the search provider was an important aspect of what we needed to do, right? Solr is not there, can't rely on it anymore. Content search API is gone, but we still need to query content for a lot of different reasons. Coveo has a great track record of success. We've used it on dozens of projects without any issue before. It's Next.js compatible. They've also got more than 5 different implementation options, from embeddable web pages to pre-built atomic components to REST APIs, right? That you can build your entire own front end from scratch, depending on what your project needs, how much flexibility you need into the front end framework for search. And this really gave us the needed flexibility with implementations as we were kind of learning the new stack and figuring out what was going to work best. And we were making these decisions and trade-offs even in the design process as we're working with the design team to be like, okay, what can we do with this framework and the implementation choices that we're trying to make with it. How did we wind up using Coveo? So the Coveo crawler was pointed at each of the sites, specifically the federated search, the WordPress blogs they have outside of the main sites, which is super helpful. So we could get all of that content to show up dynamically on the sites. We use the atomic components to build the search experiences because there's a lot of that was already pre-made and allowed us to kind of spend time on some of the other more important aspects of the site. And we have dozens of search pages across the entire site that are limited to different content types and more than a half dozen different complex dynamic components that are hitting the search API to pull different content that's got 3-4 different types of filters on it, pulling dynamically into hundreds and thousands of pages across the site. So a lot going on with Coveo, and it helped us solve a lot of the problems we were running into around query complexity. So it was really helpful along the way. So let's talk a little bit about the happy path.
Sure. So when you're first getting started in this, I want to say, like, start simple, right? Pick a component like that you can do. Maybe it's like a simple hero banner, no interactivity, no integrations, just getting field data out of Sitecore and into a component, right? So you can follow some of the recipes. I had heard there were going to be recipes published. I don't think those are out yet. But you do have the starter kit components you can take a look at, and there are still like the walkthroughs and the Sitecore documentation that you can look at. And once you sort of understand how the pieces fit together, building a very basic component in Headless is just as simple as it was in MVC, right? Get the data out of site, get the field data out of Sitecore, you drop it into the field renderers in your component, and you put the component in a placeholder, and voila, there you go. Ship something to QA. You've built your basic component, like get something out there to your, your lower environment, which is ideally using, XM Cloud, Experience Edge, and Vercel, and do your QA testing there. Get something out there that will build your team's confidence. It will build your testers' familiarity with the system, and it will give you something to show to the customer to say, hey, look, we're making progress already. And I want to emphasize the importance when you're working with a new technology of doing your retros. So a lot of the times when you start to feel crunch, or just the team is like, I don't have anything to talk about, the retro is like one of the first rituals that seems to get cut that I've noticed. I think it's very important for your team to have something like this. If it's not a formal meeting, maybe an informal sort of rolling retro as you do each component, or as you sort of go through each ticket. You really want to understand what's working, what isn't, refine your patterns early, especially when you're working with these simpler components. Because like I said, it's cheaper to unwind mistakes earlier on than it is later. And I wanted to spend a little more time talking about, Experience Edge and Vercel, and why I keep saying you want to get here as soon as possible. Again, this is another point of confusion. Like, everyone hears people dropping these names when you're going to the Sitecore meetups and you're reading the documentation, watching the videos. But do you really know what they are? Because I didn't, and I had to try to figure it out. And I found that a lot of people I'm talking to who are new to this, they don't really understand what they are. So what is Experience Edge? Simply, it is your content in the cloud. What it is not is a Sitecore CD server. And its function is to essentially host the layout service and the GraphQL endpoints. And those are the two things you're going to use to get your content out of Sitecore. And the way that Experience Edge works is that from the CM server, your XM Cloud server, you are publishing your content to this system, and it gets transformed on the way there, right? So when you publish to the layout service, Sitecore is essentially pre-rendering your page, like all the information about your page, as a JSON structure, and pushing that out to Experience Edge. You're also getting the sort of raw item data into Experience Edge that you can query with GraphQL, and again, get that information back as JSON. So what is Vercel? Vercel is, quite simply, it's your web application in the cloud. Like I said before, headless does not mean serverless. You still have servers somewhere. There's still a computer that is handling someone else's computer that is, handling your web request and returning a response. So Vercel is taking on that role. If you're running Next.js locally, you're probably running like a node server on your machine. So Vercel is sort of, taking that to the next level. It offers static site generation, and it offers some dynamicism around that. And, for more details on that, I would say watch Liz's excellent talk that was right before us for a lot of information about some of the options you might get there. And you want to get your project here as soon as possible. I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not even start development, I would say, until you have a lower environment running with XM Cloud, Experience Edge, and Vercel, and you have sort of like the starter kit app deploying to it. So unfortunately, not every journey follows the happy path. And, with all that planning and prep, you're still going to run into some hazards you have to overcome. Mm-hmm. So the first one I want to talk about is dynamic content. And I want to first start by defining dynamic content. And that is a list of content retrieved based on the relationships to another content item. So why is this a challenge, in this new ecosystem? It's because the way we used to do it before, using the content search API, which is typically backed by Solr, or, God forbid, database queries using, fast query or whatever, we would just sort of do it in our controllers or, our view models, and just sort of wrap it all up, each request, go fetch that dynamic content, and, take it from there when we render the view. It's going to be a little bit different in the world of headless, because your content, is disconnected from your app. So whatever logic you have that's going to relate that content together, your app still needs to be able to take care of it, but it needs to be able to query it out of, you know, Sitecore, out of Experience Edge in a different way, right? So, like I said, Solar in the database query is not available headlessly. We talked about using our search provider, Coveo. You can hit up the API if you need to make content queries there. You can also use GraphQL. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about GraphQL. So GraphQL is an interesting thing. And if you've been working with Sitecore for a while, especially if you've been playing with Headless before, it's really important to understand that there are actually 3 versions of GraphQL. And if you're new to this and you're Googling, you know, how to do things in GraphQL, how to structure a query, you may find some stuff that's using the old sort of like legacy Sitecore XP headless GraphQL. And that is a completely different implementation than what you're going to be dealing with in XM Cloud. So that being said, in XM Cloud, you've still got 2 different implementations of GraphQL, but they're using sort of the same schema and querying syntax. So you've got the GraphQL endpoint for CM, which connects directly to the CM server. When that query executes, the implementation is actually still using Solar. If you dig into your logs, you'll see queries hitting Solar from your GraphQL requests. Then you have GraphQL for Experience Edge. And unfortunately, we have found that there are differences here. And some of them are subtle, some of them are not so subtle, but they're, you know, instead of implementing the execution of these queries against Solar, they're implementing the execution of these queries against Content Hub, which is, you know, who knows what that is. I can't decompile those DLLs and dig in to see what's going on there because it's a SaaS service. So use the right version of GraphQL. When in doubt, use GraphQL for Experience Edge for everything, because ultimately that's going to be the only one available to you when you're actually, you know, when your website's being served up to your customer. Keep it simple. So this implementation of GraphQL for Experience Edge, there are complexity limits. So if you pile too many fields into your query, or you have too many refinements, you're going to get back an error. And it's going to say that your query is too complex and you got to simplify it. Sometimes that can be like you added one more field, like, oh, I need the alt tag on this image to come back from my search query. For accessibility, you throw the alt tag into the GraphQL results block, and now boom, your query got too complex and it won't work. It'll really happen that fast. So you really want to be careful with that and do thorough testing with real world content to make sure your queries are going to work. It's also important to understand that Experience Edge has request limits. You can't just blast Experience Edge with queries, and you especially want to be careful that you're not opening up Experience Edge to DDoS attacks from, you know, malicious users who, you know, if you have an API that just goes straight from the client right to Experience Edge, and there's no sort of caching layer in between there, you can very easily hit that limit. And it's a pretty generous limit of 80 requests per second right now. But you know, if you had a dedicated attacker, they could bring down your whole site if they were able to throttle Experience Edge in that way. And once again, we talked about the importance of planning ahead. You know, vet your requirements before you commit to them. Understand, am I going to do this with GraphQL? Can I do this with the layout service? Do I need to bring my search provider into the mix? You want to understand that. And sometimes the best query is no query at all. Can you fulfill this requirement? Getting a little clever. Could you make a custom content resolver to fulfill the requirement? Because it's okay if that gets statically rendered, like it's not going to change. Think about things like that. A little bit more on GraphQL here. I think I talked about already that it has 3 different implementations. So you want to make sure you are using the right one for the task. So when do you use GraphQL instead of the layout service? It's really when you need to fetch content that's not explicitly defined by the rendering, the data source, or the rendering parameters on that component, right? If you like content relationships are the classic example. So once again, make sure you're using the right one for the task at hand. And then Matt, I believe this one is you.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about configuring some of the search components too, right? We ran into some challenges here. Caveo was a great sidekick along the way, but there were some issues we ran into and some trade-offs we had to make. One of those being the fact that we chose the atomic components for the implementation of the search interfaces. And although they did greatly speed up the development, they have limited design customizability. And the features that are available in the atomic components isn't necessarily the full suite of what you can do with Caveo. So we had some issues there with what we wanted to be able to do with the search interfaces versus what we could do with the choice of the atomic component implementation. There is some customization going on there, but it's time consuming to do. So definitely work with design to make sure that if that's a decision that's made early, that you're sticking very close to the rails of what those things are capable of. And that we couldn't ultimately use Caveo for everything that was dynamic, right? We were talking about the custom resolvers and GraphQL and using those wherever we could, and only really having to lean on Caveo when it was simply too complex to solve with those other tools. We also created a need for an additional publishing target because Caveo crawls a database, not the flat files on the edge side, right? Not edge.
Yeah, that's Caveo's Sitecore connector.
Right. Caveo's Sitecore connector is still looking for a database. So we have essentially what is a web database present there, but that is only used for Caveo to crawl. So you actually have to publish a page to both targets, one to get it to show up in search, one to actually send it live, or you have to publish to Edge separately, which is kind of annoying because you can't actually do both at the same time. You have to actually do them separately. So some complication has come in there. And the fact that Caveo, great tool, all kinds of amazing things you can do with it. But as we know with any complex tool that has a lot of levers you can pull, that means the configuration can be rather complex, right? There's a lot of different switches to flick and things to configure. I would definitely recommend you lean on your contact at Caveo. They're really good about getting you somebody to help make recommendations on configuration, about getting in and double checking the implementation, making sure the analytics are pulling in correctly, and consulting you on what fixes for those look like. You can put these folks in front of the client if you need to. They're a fantastic resource if you wind up leaning on Caveo as well. I would also recommend that it has machine learning models built into it that'll take user interaction with search, and it will tune the relevance of the result set over time with those algorithms. I would recommend that you trust that machine learning algorithm, which means it's going to need to run for a few months to get a full data set and really start to see some major improvements there. But don't over configure it out of the gate. Set up those machine learning models, let them learn for a little bit before you start going in and doing really heavy tweaking on the user experience with the configurations there. The other thing we wanted to talk about on the next slide was that we were also bringing personalize into the mix, because personalization was something we needed to deliver as part of this project, but we don't have XP anymore, right? So we had to work with personalize to accomplish those goals. The first issue you're going to run into is that if you don't have folks that are proficient or super knowledgeable about personalize, is that they're going to need to ramp into that pretty quickly. There are entire paradigm shifts that happen here as well around how you solve a problem, how things work, what you use it to personalize, and how it doesn't use your existing component set, right? There's fewer pre-built rules in XP, and the two things are better at very different things. And there's ultimately more flexibility with personalized out of the box than there was in XP out of the box. But if you want to really, it can't do the same jobs, right? So some of those things that XP was really good at is like, I want to A/B test this component, or just really quickly swap this rendering out for a different one for users who meet this criteria or whatever. That's tougher. That particular job is tougher with personalized, not impossible. And the components that you've built out in your headless environment in XM, whatever, are not, the front end for those are not readily available in personalized. It's an entirely different storage mechanism for like the components that are being used and swapped out. It's got different constructs for code structure and declaring variables in them and everything else. So there's learning that has to happen there. It is JS heavy, so you're gonna need some developer help in there, or just a really skilled marketer who happens to know JavaScript really well. But your standard content author, not going to be useful in this platform. It definitely requires some skill sets here with JavaScript to get anything done in personalized, outside of the base templates. And I would definitely say, speaking of those base templates, to use those examples again. Get in there, pull one up, take a look at what it's doing. How is it declaring variables? What are the options? How is it, making space for this in the layout? What JavaScript is being fired, and how is it adjusting the DOM in order to account for this component space, etc. Pull those open, dissect them, figure out what's going on. It's a great way to kind of learn some of the things you can really do with the tool. And again, ultimately, I think a lot more flexible than XP is out of the box, but it's not going to solve the same problems. So if you put together, some sort of personalization strategy that's leaning on what you could achieve with XP out of the box, it's going to require a lot more work to implement that in personalized. But if you go in setting one up that's focused on what you can do with personalized out of the box or very near it, you'll be in a much better place project-wise. Other issues that we encountered in recommendations we would make was specifically around multi-site, multilingual. This is something that we should have started dealing with in the project sooner than we did. Trying to get some of these things to work with Next.js and Vercel, it just didn't work the same way we expected it to from our experience with MVC. Again, making that mistake, right, of like leaning on our MVC experience. We're like, oh man, you used to be able to get multilingual and multi-site stuff to work super easy in MVC. There's so much work has been done around base Sitecore and supporting that kind of out of the box. You just set up some system items and it all pretty much just works, right? It was really easy to get that running back in the day. It's a little bit more work now. Well, I don't know if it's more work. It's different work, right?
It's
Again,
different.
our framework's
Yeah.
changed. Yeah. There's new levers to pull, new variables that have to be set, new things that need to be defined. And that's going to require some time to get used to and figure out how to deal with that. So if this is a part of what you need to deal with, like get on this early, make sure you work out the nuances here. Even if it is just get one other language up, make sure you can get that page live. The URL structure is what you want on a different language, etc. Make sure you have those base language concepts kind of dealt with out of the box. Our components, additionally, they had to be language aware because we had right to left and left to right languages, where the fallback rules varying by language for a whole bunch of different things like accessibility and sitemaps and canonicals and form field validation rules having to note the difference between languages. A lot of complexity in here that we'd be mostly accustomed to dealing with in the MVC situations. Again, we have to deal with here, but again, a lot of these look a little bit different in the new world. So just take your time to go through those. Make sure you make time early to tackle those issues. the language resolution in Vercel, and this is important again as a note to like get into an environment that models your production as soon as humanly possible, because the language resolution in Vercel behaved differently for us than it did in our lower environments. You know, we got in there, we set a bunch of this up, we thought we were good. We pushed everything to it, you know, later on a Vercel environment that we set up, and everything's broken. Get into those environments as soon as possible, as far as like being able to mirror what production is going to look like. Again, it's a lot of these things. The first time you're going through them will kind of feel a little bit like a black box. Well, you'll get better with these as you continue to go through dealing with language versions in GraphQL and or Coveo and in Vercel and everything else, and how to sort some of these up. Again, it's not, none of it's really horribly more complicated. It's just different again. And that's been the biggest issue that we've been facing kind of throughout this whole process. Multi-site is the same kind of way. This wasn't nearly as bad as the multilingual options though. You know, each site requires its own Vercel tenant. The SXA scaffolding though that's available there for multi-site still works great. And I would definitely urge you to rely on that and make full use of it. The next set of problems that we had to deal with was specifically the content haul. You know, in our first presentation, migrating pages looked really easy, but migrating pages is hard. It's something we have to do as part of every project, you know, mapping content changes and fields have been broken up and moved and changed type and everything else, and getting content from one place to another. If you're not doing a like for like, but you're actually changing data models, is a nightmare. It's something we have to do again with every project anytime we do this. But just get on it early, tackle it. Migration by and large doesn't look any different than it does in a normal or a historical MVC project. But just don't forget about it with everything else that's going on. The other thing that I want to talk about here for a little bit is content life cycles, right? Understand that, you know, between workflow approval, publishing to Edge, for us, a separate indexing for Coveo, static site generation on Vercel, the client has typically, the authors have a cadence. They've probably been using it since the last redesign. It's probably been 5-6 years. They have a way they're used to interacting with the system. Some of those ways are going to change. Publishing takes longer to Edge. It naturally publishes everything with like the idea of related items on, right? Going and getting everything it needs to statically generate that page. But it takes longer than it does to just publish something without related items on, which a lot of authors are typically used to. There's conversations and expectations that need to be set early on around this. Things are going to feel different. One of the biggest things that we have to keep having conversations about is the fact that just because you publish something doesn't mean it's live on the site immediately. It has to be generated, but that new generated static page isn't going to be served to a user the next time somebody hits that. It's the time after that. And or if nobody's hitting it, at the very least, there's like a Vercel cache timeout thing that has to happen, right? This has been an important concept because it means that sometimes somebody can approve something and it's not live for 20-30 minutes or more. And that's a new thing that authors have been having to get used to. And there's definitely growing pains there. You know, a lot of this stuff will be straightforward when we're dealing with a single content page, but when you have linked content, you have shared data sources, you have things that are dynamic. How do these now function in a new world where pages are being generated statically, depending on how you built the different things and what's being updated in real time on the edge and what's not? There's new expectations that have to be set there for authors, for reviewers, and those conversations should begin as early as possible to help prepare them for that new world and what that's going to look like. You don't want it to be a shock, ideally right before launch, when they're like, I published this page, it's been 20 minutes, I'm still not seeing it, what's up? That's going to be a problem if it waits that long.
And finally, I just want to say, in light of everything we just talked about, you do have support systems in place, take advantage of them. You're going to have customer success managers for each major platform you're working with. You're definitely going to get one from Sitecore. You're probably going to get a partner technical advisor too, a PTA. Come prepared to those weekly meetings you have with that person with questions and sort of like, things you want them to answer for you. You're going to get a CSM at Vercel as well. There are going to be problems you're going to run into with Next.js or Vercel that have nothing to do with Sitecore, right? And you're going to want to lean on those folks to help you out there. Same thing with Coveo and whatever other system you're integrating with. So nurture those relationships, attend your check-ins, be open with your challenges early on. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Because honestly, what I've found is that, from talking to these folks is, this technology is still pretty early, and there are some gaps that you might identify for them. There are some bugs you might find. There are some things like, oh, wow, we haven't thought about that before. Let's brainstorm on a solution together. So definitely nurture those relationships and don't be afraid to take advantage of them. So finally, we had a couple slides talking about the end result, but I figured it'd be better just to show you the sites. So here is the new Children's National site. This is entirely statically rendered with Next.js and Sitecore. I'll show you some of the more interactive features here. Like we've got
I'm still seeing the 14 goals.
Am I showing the wrong thing? Hold on. How's that? Start over.
That's better. That's the location there. So.
Okay. Here's the new homepage. As you can see here, this is a sort of a little personalization widget we've got here. So depending on when you self-identify in one of these roles, you're going to get some different links here. Some of the major sort of features is we've got this location finder. I don't know how well this is going out over Zoom, but this is entirely driven by Coveo. These are, I think, almost out of the box Coveo Hive components. I think the only thing maybe we built custom is this location finder. We've got our Find a Doctor, which for a healthcare site, like that's the important content. You've got your locations and you've got your providers. So this is the Kairos integration. So if I want to look for oncology, search for that. This kicks us over to Kairos, which is outside of Sitecore. That's why you can see how long this page took to load when it wasn't statically rendered in Vercel. So yeah, I mean, you can click around here and it comes up pretty quick. So here's an example of one of the other sites. We mentioned there are 5 websites. This is their foundation site which they use to drive donations. Children's National is a nonprofit. They do have a big donation drive every year. They are in the midst of their fundraising campaign right now, and they're very heavily, making edits to this site and using personalized to add some sort of calls to action and things like that. So please, it's childrensnational.org. Feel free to peruse the site if you want to see what we did, poke around. If you find any bugs, tell Matt I'm on vacation. And thank you guys for sticking around so late. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for showcasing this wonderful journey for us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. It was really nice to talk to everybody. And the other presentations before this were excellent.
To address the question in the chat, so Liz said that on-demand RSA solves the problem of clearing the edge cache. And the previous user group, which was a month ago, there was a speaker from Sitecore, Justin Luster, his name.
Yep.
So he showcased that exactly, and he was also presenting it at SuCon. So
Yeah,
exactly.
so here's a dirty little secret about this build is it's not actually on XM Cloud. It's on it's on managed XM and it's on Sitecore 10.2. Getting onto the cloud, I think, is on the roadmap, but it is just not a priority for the client right now. And when we initiated the project, XM Cloud was not ready. So we do have a situation where when you publish a page, it does trigger regeneration in Vercel, but you have to sort of do a double refresh to make that happen. One of the challenges we have, actually, let me just bring up this one real quick. This is their research site, and believe it or not, this is ASP.NET MVC running in Vercel. This one is a lot harder to get the changes to regenerate, and it's been the customer has been very, I think, just sort of confused. And generally, it's like, well, we got to wait for the Vercel cache to time out. We have it set, I think, to 30 minutes to see a lot of these changes here. But in general, what we're talking about is like dynamic content. Like a lot of their content is around specialties, right? Let me actually go back to the main site here. Where are the specialty care?
Health library has got
Health library, is that what you want me to show?
Yeah, that and departments has a lot of content.
Yeah, so we've got like, they have all of these specialties, and this content is pulled into a lot of other pages. Another thing that gets pulled into a lot of other pages are providers and their labs, right? The actual like laboratories that they have. So when they update those page and publish it, great. I see the change on this specialty, but now all the other content that is perhaps statically rendered that references this does not get updated. So how do we solve that? In some cases, it's, we pull it in dynamically using Caveo, but we try not to do that too much because it, that's another request once you've loaded the page. Caveo also has API limits. So if they really need to say like they updated this prep specialty and they really need to see like the updated FAQ or whatever, or the description on this other page that's pulling in the content, well, they got to publish that other page too. They got to go in and do a republish to Edge to make that happen. That's been a point of, I think, a little bit of frustration for the customer. Because in the old MVC world, the page gets generated every time you request it. So trying to find that balance of like, we went pretty much all in on SSR, or on SSG rather. Finding the balance between what should be statically rendered and maybe what are some like islands of dynamicism in your statically rendered page. That's an area we still need to explore. Oh, Martin, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Liz, you want to ask something?
Yeah, can I ask a question? So earlier on in the presentation, you were talking about struggles with kind of like local container development around Macs, and just something in general that I'm interested in is how that strategy was, especially with regards to XM Cloud, for maybe local development of just the web app and connecting it to pages. Like, did you guys have experience around that? Was that useful?
Yeah, so we're not using pages on Children's, they're using Experience Editor. We do have another XM Cloud build that's getting like really close to launching that is using pages, and we're using the same development patterns and process on that project. So generally, like I mentioned that our front end devs use Storybook. That really is like our front end team they don't just work on Sitecore sites. We also at Valier, we've got an Optimizely practice, we've got a Drupal practice, we've got an AEM practice, we have a bunch of different CMSs. So that team can sort of be tapped to work on any one of those accounts. It's sort of their process and training is around building in Storybook and then doing a delivery, a handoff to the CMS team. In the XM Cloud, the Next.js world, that, like I said, those lines were blurred. And because of the method the pattern we set up, they can actually build Sitecore logic if they want to. Like we've got all the property mappings, like the backend developer will handle getting the properties and mapping those out of Experience Edge and setting that up, passing that along into like the main component TSX. And then either one of them can sort of wire up the business logic from there. You know, a storybook, we might do it with mock data. And if the Sitecore developer is doing it, you know, they can do it with real Sitecore data. We also, the Sitecore or the front end devs can connect their local rendering hosts to, you know, the dev environment in Experience Edge and just do it that way. That way has worked too.
And how, sorry to get so detailed on this, but how was the, sorry, with Storybook, so are you mocking the layout service, or are you sort of reshaping that data model to just mock sort of what a design system component needs?
Yeah, we're essentially mocking the data model in Storybook. So there's like a separate sort of file. Like when we scaffold out a component, this is really technical, and I didn't like, I would really want like our lead dev and the lead front end dev here, because they're the ones who came up with all this. But essentially, you know, when we scaffold out a component, it builds like tests. It builds like a mock file with the mock properties, and it builds the actual TS file that does that get static props from Experience Edge. So like there's some glue there to say, like, when I'm in Storybook, we're using the mock data, and when I'm in Sitecore, we're using like the get static props that pulls it out of Experience Edge.
Cool. So there's not like a shaper that like, I don't like the component you're building in Storybook is still the same data shape as what's coming from GraphQL. Because I've seen people do like SXA wrappers to like, so that their front end design team can just build it how they want, and then there's sort of like a higher order component that kind of mocks the Sitecore.
Yeah, we played with that model early on, and we found it just wasn't as efficient as saying like backend dev go in there, define the data model, essentially set up the properties, and then we pass it off to front end to actually build the UI, and then to wire up the business logic. Either one of them can take it from there.
That's great. Cool. Thank you for.
Yep.
Before we split them on a repository, so still yet as of today, we have on the option of mono repository. It will get changed really soon, because there will be separate separate front-end repository split from the XM Cloud repository, and you do deployment with both. But as of today, you don't have this option, and the only way you can do separation of front-end development is by using Storybook. So whatever subset of data of layout is your component receiving, your front-end developer is mocking that kind of subset of JSON data for the component. They do edge tests and scenarios, edge cases, all of that. That's how it works. Actually, the another testing solution which is good is Cypress, which is much better than Selenium. And I think I will be presenting the next Headless Sitecore Headless user group exactly about that. I will be presenting Cypress and tested cases if I make progress with it.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. Yeah, so I mean, since this is coming up, you're not the first one to ask us about this. Like, I think that might be that'd be like a really like sort of like hardcore technical session to talk about the pattern we used. And honestly, I think it would be good to get feedback from the community to like shoot some holes in it, because it does feel a little unwieldy right now, and I feel like it could be optimized for sure. So.
Okay, great. Once again, congratulations with this milestone. You achieved the really solid spec website delivered with this XFC. So congratulations on that.
Yeah.
Thank you
So
very much
I mean, just this could be XM Cloud. for all intents and purposes. It's just, you know, we built it that way. We just got to migrate it over. So
Not much standing in the way of that at this point.